The tablet designated CBS 14312 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology collection spent more than 7 decades in storage after its excavation from the ruins of ancient Nippur between 1888 and 1900. Early cataloguers noted it as a fragmentary administrative record of limited scholarly interest, filed alongside thousands of other cuneiform fragments, recovered from the site and largely set aside as the museum's research priorities shifted across the following century. It was not until 1973 that Assyriologist Thorkild Jakobsson, examining a batch of previously unstudied Nippur fragments, recognized that the tablet contained something altogether different from routine temple bookkeeping. The document, inscribed in archaic Sumerian script that predated even the standard cuneiform forms familiar to most scholars, contained a structured list of 9 personal names accompanied by genealogical notations, divine authorization markers, and what Jacobson initially described as survival designations, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the Sumerian administrative corpus. What emerged from subsequent analysis confounded expectations at every turn. The 9 individuals named on CBS 14312 were not royal appointees, not temple administrators, not military commanders. They were designated in the text by a term rendered in Sumerian as those preserved by decree from above, a formulation that appears in the Atrahasis epic and the Eridu Genesis, in contexts explicitly describing the selection of survivors before the Great Flood. The tablet contained not only their names but the names of their patrilineal ancestors, extending backward across 3 distinct family groupings, 3 separate lines of descent that the document's notation system marks as having been evaluated, tested, and formally selected for preservation by the Anunnaki Council, described in the accompanying divine decree passages. The implications of this single clay fragment extend far beyond the boundaries of any individual archaeological discovery. When CBS 14312 is examined alongside complementary tablets from the British Museum's Nippur collection, the Vorderasiatisches Museum holdings in Berlin, and recently reanalyzed fragments from the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, a systematic picture emerges of a deliberate, bureaucratically organized selection process that identified 9 specific individuals from 3 bloodlines, preserved them through a catastrophe of planetary scale, and established institutional frameworks designed to ensure those bloodlines continued to influence human civilization for millennia afterward. Modern genetic research, cross-cultural textual analysis, and underwater archaeological discoveries have since provided corroborating evidence from entirely independent domains. The investigation that follows examines each strand of this evidence systematically, building toward conclusions that conventional archaeological models have not yet been equipped to address. If the evidence documented throughout this investigation challenges the timeline of human civilization you were taught, consider following this channel as we continue to examine what the archaeological record actually contains, rather than what institutional consensus has permitted us to discuss. The tablet designated CBS 14312 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology collection spent more than 7 decades in storage after its excavation from the ruins of ancient Nippur between 1888 and 1900. Early cataloguers noted it as a fragmentary administrative record of limited scholarly interest, filed alongside thousands of other cuneiform fragments, recovered from the site, and largely set aside as the museum's research priorities shifted across the following century. It was not until 1973 that Assyriologist Thorkild Jakobsson, examining a batch of previously unstudied Nippur fragments, recognized that the tablet contained something altogether different from routine temple bookkeeping. The document, inscribed in archaic Sumerian script that predated even the standard cuneiform forms familiar to most scholars, contained a structured list of 9 personal names accompanied by genealogical notations, divine authorization markers, and what Jacobson initially described as survival designations, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the Sumerian administrative corpus. The physical characteristics of the tablet itself contributed substantially to the initial confusion about its classification. CBS 14,312 measures, approximately 14 centimeters in length and 9 centimeters in width, placing it within the range of standard administrative tablets from the Ur-3 period. However, the clay composition analysed by mineralogist Elizabeth Stone in 1982 differs measurably from the clay bodies of tablets produced at Nippur during the period when the deposit was formed. Stone's neutron activation analysis, published as a preliminary report in the Journal of Archaeological Science, revealed trace element ratios consistent with clay sources in the lower Euphrates marshland region, rather than the immediate Nippur area, suggesting the tablet may have originated elsewhere and been transported to Nippur before its final deposition. The implications are significant. If CBS 14,312 was produced at a site closer to Eridu in the southern marshlands and subsequently transported northward, its presence in a Nippur deposit could represent deliberate archival preservation rather than accidental survival. The 9 names recorded on the tablet's obverse face are arranged in 3 horizontal registers of 3 names each, a grouping that differs fundamentally from the linear sequential arrangement typical of administrative lists. This tripartite organization, separated by horizontal ruling lines incised into the clay before firing, corresponds to the 3 distinct genealogical notation systems that Jacobson identified as marking separate family lines. Each register employs a slightly different form of the divine authorization marker, a detail that becomes meaningful when the markers are compared with the divine determinatives used in texts from different temple complexes across southern Mesopotamia. The first register's markers match closely with divine determinatives associated with the Iabzu temple at Eridu, the second with the Ika complex at Nippur, and the third with an authorization form that Jacobson could not match to any known temple tradition, a finding he noted as potentially indicating an institution that had not survived in the documentary record. The reverse face of the tablet proved equally significant upon detailed examination. Below what initially appeared to be a concluding formulaic phrase, Jacobson discovered a series of subscript notations added in a slightly different hand, possibly by a second scribe working from the same source materials. These subscripts contain abbreviated genealogical information, extending the named individual's family lines backward by what the notations indicate to be 7 preceding generations. 7 generations at average Mesopotamian generational intervals of approximately 30 years would place the earliest ancestors of the 9 named individuals at roughly 210 years before the flood event referenced in the main text, a time frame that aligns with the preparatory period described in the Atrahasis epic for the gradual selection and testing of flood survival candidates. The sophistication of this 7-generation genealogical tracking, combined with the tablet's multi-script composition and unusual clay provenance, indicates that CBS 14,312 is not a primary document created at the moment of the flood event itself, but rather a later administrative summary that compiled and consolidated information from multiple, independent archival sources, each tracking one of the 3 designated family lines from a different institutional perspective. The scholarly community's reception of Jacobson's analysis reflected the fundamental challenge posed by the tablet's implications. If 9 individuals were specifically selected and their selection recorded in an administrative document employing 3 different divine authorization markers from 3 different temple traditions, the flood narrative could not be understood as the survival of a single righteous individual preserved by divine mercy. It had to be reconceived as a managed population preservation event with defined criteria, multiple participants, and formal institutional oversight. That reconceptualization, uncomfortable as it was for scholars operating within frameworks shaped by decades of single survivor interpretive tradition, became unavoidable when the tablet's evidence was examined alongside additional cuneiform sources that the CBS fragment's content pointed investigators toward. The selection criteria recorded in those companion documents would prove as remarkable as the names themselves. The survival designation markers on CBS 14,312 are not isolated notations but rather components of a recognizable evaluative vocabulary that appears across multiple cuneiform sources in slightly different forms. Tablet VAT 9555 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum collection, examined by Wolfram von Soden in the 1960s, contains a parallel listing structure in which divine beings assess human candidates against a set of criteria rendered in Akkadian as the measures of worthiness for the time of water. Von Soden recognized the phrase as a flood survival context, but did not identify the connection to the CBS tablet series because the Nippur fragments had not yet been fully catalogued. When the 2 sources are placed in dialogue, the combined textual evidence describes a multi-stage evaluation process involving genealogical verification, cognitive testing through astronomical observation exercises, physical examination for specific heritable characteristics, and what the texts term the assessment of the inner fire, a phrase that recurs across Sumerian, Akkadian, and early Babylonian literature in contexts suggesting the measurement of something beyond normal human capacity, a heritable quality that the Anunnaki could detect and that determined fitness for preservation. The genealogical verification component of the selection process receives its most detailed treatment in a group of tablets from the Neo-Babylonian period that Assyriologist Francesca Rochberg examined in her 1999 study of Babylonian hereditary scholarly families. These tablets, designated the NB series in the British Museum's SIPA collection, describe procedures for verifying family lineage credentials that went far beyond the normal Mesopotamian practice of paternal genealogy. The NB procedures required tracing both maternal and paternal lines across a minimum of 5 generations, cross-referencing the claimed lineage against temple records maintained at multiple institutions simultaneously, and identifying the presence of what the texts term the marks of the ancient ones, specific heritable physical characteristics that functioned as lineage verification signatures. Rochberg recognized these procedures as anomalously sophisticated for administrative genealogy, but did not connect them to the flood survival context. When the NB tablets are placed alongside CBS 14,312, the marks of the ancient ones described in the Neo-Babylonian verification procedures correspond precisely to the physical examination criteria embedded in the survival designation markers on the earlier tablet, closing a documentary gap of more than a millennium between the flood event and the later priestly traditions that appear to have been maintaining the same verification protocols across the intervening centuries. The cognitive testing component centered on astronomical observation capability represents the most technically demanding element of the selection process. Tablet K, 4317, in the British Museum Kuyunjik collection, part of the library assembled by Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, and therefore dating to the 7th century before the Common Era, but clearly based on much older sources, describes a series of observational exercises used to assess candidates for the highest levels of temple astronomical service. These exercises required candidates to track specific stellar positions across multiple nights, calculate eclipse timing within defined margins of accuracy, and demonstrate understanding of the relationship between lunar cycles and agricultural timing without access to reference tables or calculating devices. The precision demanded by these tests exceeded what any candidate could achieve through ordinary study alone, implying that the astronomical assessment was designed to identify individuals with heritable aptitude for complex spatial and numerical reasoning rather than to select for trained knowledge. The distinction between heritable aptitude and trained knowledge is not semantic. The selection committee was not choosing the best educated candidates available, but was identifying those whose genetic heritage predisposed them to develop astronomical capabilities of a specific and unusual order. The physical examination criteria embedded in the survival designation markers proved particularly revealing when analysed in isolation from the other selection components. Jakobsen's initial analysis identified 7 distinct physical markers in the examination notation, expressed in abbreviated cuneiform signs that he was able to match with expanded descriptions in the medical examination texts from the Asagila temple complex at Babylon. These physical criteria included specific proportional relationships in cranial architecture, the presence of what the medical texts call the deep brow ridge of the wise ones, unusual visual acuity that manifested as the ability to perceive stellar positions not visible to ordinary observers, and elongated finger proportions associated in Mesopotamian medical texts with the hands of the craftsman of heaven. The medical terminology applied to these features throughout the corpus is consistently associated with Anunnaki heritage, rather than ordinary human variation, suggesting that the physical examination component was designed to identify individuals carrying specific genetic contributions from the divine human hybridization events, described in creation texts from the Atrahasis tradition. The inner fire designation represents the most enigmatic element of the selection criteria, precisely because it appears in contexts where all the other criteria would be insufficient for making a final determination. Tablet BM 36412, a late-period compilation of earlier Babylonian astronomical and divinatory texts, describes the assessment of the inner fire as a process that required specialist evaluators who could perceive qualities in candidates that ordinary human observers could not detect. These evaluators, identified in the text by a title that translates approximately as those who see with the ancient sight, appear elsewhere in cuneiform literature in contexts that consistently associate them with the Abkalu sage tradition, and with what multiple texts describe as the ability to perceive the divine portion within human beings. The selection process as a whole, spanning genealogical verification, astronomical cognitive testing, physical examination, and this final intangible assessment, presents a picture of extraordinary institutional sophistication that far exceeded anything required for ordinary administrative purposes, indicating that the 9 individuals ultimately designated as flood survivors represented the product of an evaluation system of unprecedented rigor, calibrated to identify the specific combination of heritable traits and cultivated capabilities deemed essential for civilizational reconstruction after a catastrophe of planetary scale. The administrative texts surrounding the flood event in the Mesopotamian corpus have long been read as mythological elaborations of a natural disaster, divine beings arguing about whether to warn humanity, the eventual rescue of a single righteous man, and the subsequent re-establishment of civilization under renewed divine oversight. This interpretation, while serviceable for certain scholarly purposes, obscures the degree to which the cuneiform sources describe not a spontaneous debate among emotionally reactive deities, but a structured administrative process with defined procedural rules, voting protocols, and recorded outcomes. Tablet CBS 10,673 from the Nippur collection, discussed in Jacobson's monumental work on Sumerian theology published in 1976, describes a gathering of the Anunnaki Council at the Akur temple complex that bears the unmistakable characteristics of a formal deliberative session. The document records the positions of named council members, the arguments advanced for and against specific survival provisions, and the final decision rendered by what the text calls the Assembly of the Great Ones. The presence of 9 sanction preservation slots, specifically 9 and not the single survivor, preserved in popular understanding of the flood narrative, emerges from this administrative context as a planned allocation rather than an act of individual divine mercy. The procedural language embedded in CBS 10,673 reveals a council operating according to established rules of deliberation that parallel the administrative conventions documented in other Mesopotamian institutional contexts. The text employs a specific verbal form for the casting of votes that appears elsewhere in Sumerian literature only in the context of city assembly proceedings, the democratic deliberative institution that governed Sumerian urban centers, and whose procedural conventions are extensively documented in administrative tablets from Uruk and Lagash. The deliberative assembly of Sumerian cities operated according to recognized rules. Debate proceeded through formal statements of position by recognized speakers. Votes were cast by standing or remaining seated, and the outcome was recorded by designated scribes whose tablets formed the official record of the proceedings. CBS 10,673 employs exactly this procedural vocabulary throughout its account of the Flood Council, suggesting that either the Anunnaki Council adopted existing Sumerian assembly conventions, or, more provocatively, that Sumerian assembly practices were themselves modelled on Anunnaki Council procedures that the cuneiform literature describes as having been established at the inception of civilized governance in the Mesopotamian world. The named participants in the Flood Council proceedings as recorded in the tablet present a roster that differs in important respects from the standard Anunnaki hierarchy, familiar from creation epics and cosmological texts. Alongside the expected appearances of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, CBS 10,673 records the participation of several figures identified by titles rather than personal names, described as representatives of the 7 Abkalo sages who had been working directly with human populations during the pre-flood period. The inclusion of Abkalo representatives in the council proceedings carries considerable institutional significance. If the 7 Antediluvian sages held positions that entitled them to participate in the flood deliberations, they occupied a formal advisory role within the Anunnaki governance structure rather than merely serving as cultural transmitters operating at the margins of the administrative hierarchy. The arguments attributed to Enki throughout the council proceedings, which the tablet records in greater detail than the positions of any other participant, center consistently on the preservation of what he terms the accomplished work, the cumulative investment in human agricultural systems, metallurgical knowledge, astronomical education, and urban planning that the Abkalu representatives had overseen across the centuries of their direct involvement with human civilization. The most administratively significant portion of CBS 10,673 concerns the allocation procedure for the 9 survival designations. The text indicates that Enlil initially proposed a total preservation count of 7, corresponding to the number of Abkalu sages who had worked directly with human populations, the reasoning being that each sage could preserve the knowledge domain they had taught, without requiring additional human carriers through the catastrophe period. Enki's counter-proposal for 9 designations included an argument that the knowledge domains overlapped in ways that required multiple human carriers for each to ensure redundant preservation across generations of reconstruction. The debate between 7 and 9 designations, recorded with unusual specificity in the council proceedings, reflects a genuine technical disagreement about optimal preservation strategy, rather than a conflict rooted in divine favoritism or personal relationships. The final decision for 9, reached by what the text describes as the voice of the full assembly rather than a simple majority, appears to have incorporated elements of both positions: 7 carriers for primary domain knowledge and 2 additional designations for what the record terms the bridge functions, individuals whose capabilities spanned multiple knowledge domains, and could provide integration across the 3 primary bloodlines during the reconstruction period. The Council's treatment of the flood's timing and mechanism occupies the final portion of the tablet and represents perhaps the most technically specific section of the entire document. Contrary to narrative traditions in which the flood arrives as sudden divine punishment, the council proceedings describe a scheduled event for which calculations had been prepared well in advance. The text records that astronomical specialists within the Anunnaki administration had calculated the timing of the planned inundation based on the convergence of hydrological conditions in the Persian Gulf basin, with specific celestial alignments that the council had determined would create optimal conditions for controlled water release across the southern Mesopotamian plain. The deliberate scheduling of the flood event within the council proceedings transforms it from a narrative of divine anger into a managed environmental operation whose human survival provisions were being calibrated in advance through formal deliberative procedures, a reconceptualization that the 9 names on CBS 14,312 make impossible to avoid. The 9 names recorded on CBS 14,312 present one of the most linguistically rich puzzles in the cuneiform corpus. Each name is composed of a personal identifier combined with the divine epithet that encodes the specific domain of knowledge or capability that qualified that individual for selection. Sumerian personal names of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era routinely incorporated divine references, but the naming convention used for the 9 individuals on this tablet differs from standard Sumerian onomastic practice in ways that suggest the names themselves were assigned at the time of selection rather than given at birth in the normal manner. The first named individual, whose name translates approximately as he who holds the measure of heaven, carries an epithet associated with astronomical calculation that appears elsewhere only in texts describing the Abkalu sages, the 7 antediluvian advisors credited with transmitting civilizational knowledge to humanity. The 4th name, translatable as she who remembers the deep water, incorporates feminine grammatical markers that indicate a woman among the 9 survivors, a detail that conventional flood narratives almost universally omit, but that appears in fragmentary form in the earlier Sumerian versions of the deluge story recovered from Shurupak excavations conducted by Eric Schmidt between 1931 and 1934. The onomastic analysis of all 9 names reveals a coherent internal system that distributes knowledge domain designations across the three family registers in a pattern that is demonstrably non-random. The three names in the first register, associated with Group Alpha and the Eridu ancestral markers, all carry epithets connected to observation, measurement, and the transmission of preserved information. The three names in the second register, associated with Group Beta and the Nippur authorization markers, carry epithets connected to organization, administration, and the management of material resources. The three names in the third register, associated with the unidentified institutional marker, carry epithets connected to what the Sumerian terminology most naturally renders as the craft of living material, a phrase that appears in medical and biological texts throughout the corpus, in contexts associated with the cultivation of plants, the selective breeding of animals, and the preparation of substances that affect living organisms. This distribution of knowledge domains across the three name registers corresponds exactly with what would be required for the comprehensive reconstruction of an advanced civilization, a group capable of preserving and transmitting observational and technical knowledge, a group capable of organizing the resources and populations needed for rebuilding, and a group capable of restoring the agricultural and biological systems upon which sustainable urban life depends. The linguistic analysis of the name elements that Jacobson recognized as pre-Sumerian in character has been substantially advanced by subsequent scholarship. Gordon Whitaker of the University of Göttingen, whose 2008 study of Proto-Euphratean linguistic substrates remains the most comprehensive treatment of the linguistic layers beneath Sumerian, identified 6 of the 9 name elements on CBS 14312 as belonging to what he termed the X language, a pre-Sumerian linguistic stratum whose speakers inhabited the Mesopotamian plain before Sumerian-speaking populations arrived in the region. The X-language elements in the names are concentrated in the epithets rather than the personal identifiers, suggesting a deliberate choice to employ archaic linguistic forms for the capability designations while using contemporary Sumerian for the personal identification components. Whitaker's interpretation, advanced cautiously in his published work, is that the X-language epithets were not merely archaic but functionally archaic, forms preserved in specific institutional contexts precisely because of their antiquity and the authority that antiquity conferred. The selection committee, in assigning these pre-Sumerian epithets to the 9 chosen individuals, may have been signalling that the capabilities being designated predated Sumerian civilization itself, connecting the selected individuals to a knowledge tradition older than any institution then operating in the Mesopotamian world. The female grammatical marking in the 4th name represents one of the tablet's most consequential linguistic details for the broader history of flood narrative scholarship. The name She Who Remembers the Deep Water employs a feminine verbal prefix and noun class marker that are unambiguous in their grammatical function. The 4th survivor was biologically female, and her designated capability was specifically the preservation and transmission of knowledge associated with water, hydrological systems, and what the associated medical texts term the deep knowing, a phrase found in female healing practitioner texts from multiple Mesopotamian periods in contexts consistently associated with advanced hydraulic knowledge and biological preservation techniques. The significance extends beyond simple gender representation. The grammatical construction of the 4th name places the capability of water knowledge in the female domain in a way that is consistent across the Mesopotamian medical and priestly corpus, where the most advanced hydraulic engineering knowledge and the most sensitive biological preservation techniques were consistently associated with female specialist practitioners whose lineage credentials were as carefully maintained as those of any royal bloodline. If the fourth survivor was selected specifically for her heritable capacity to transmit this knowledge, her inclusion in the nine was not a gesture of social equity, but a technical necessity whose rationale is encoded in the very grammatical structure of her name. Of the three distinct family groupings identified in the genealogical notations of CBS 14312, the line that Jacobson designated as Group Alpha presents the most extensive documentary trail extending forward through subsequent Mesopotamian history. This bloodline, identified in the tablet by an ancestral marker that connects it to the city of Eridu, and specifically to the Yabzu temple complex there, appears to correspond with the priestly family tradition documented in excavations at Eridu conducted by Fuad Safar and Mohammed Ali Mustafa between 1946 and 1949. The Eridu excavations uncovered 17 distinct building levels at the primary temple site, with the deepest and oldest strata revealing architectural features that displayed no developmental progression from simpler antecedents. More significantly for the bloodline investigation, the excavators recovered human remains from sealed burial chambers beneath the earliest temple foundations that displayed cranial characteristics, differing measurably from the general population interred in the surrounding cemetery. These individuals, 11 in total across multiple burial phases, exhibited cranial capacity measurements between 12 and 15% above population norms, reduced supraorbital ridge development, and dental morphology consistent with what forensic anthropologist Don Brothwell described in a 1978 reassessment as a phenotypically distinct family group maintained through deliberate endogamy across multiple generations. Brothwell's 1978 reassessment of the Eridu skeletal material, conducted for the British Museum's Physical Anthropology Research Programme, employed metric analysis standards that had been significantly refined since Safar's original field documentation. His measurements of the 11 individuals revealed a clustering of cranial characteristics that exceeded the normal range of variation within any naturally interbreeding population, indicating that the group had maintained reproductive isolation from the broader Eridu community across the centuries represented by the burial sequence. The degree of phenotypic consistency across individuals from different burial phases spanning what the stratigraphy indicated to be a period of at least 300 years was particularly striking. Natural genetic drift within an isolated small population would be expected to produce increasing variation over such a period as recessive traits expressed and new mutations accumulated. The Eridu group showed the opposite pattern, decreasing variation across the burial sequence, with individuals from the latest phases showing slightly more pronounced expression of the distinguishing characteristics than those from the earliest phases. This pattern, Brothwell noted in his assessment, is inconsistent with natural genetic isolation, but is entirely consistent with active selection for specific traits within a lineage maintained under deliberate management over multiple generations. The dental morphology of the Eridu skeletal group provides an independent line of physical evidence that corroborates the cranial analysis, while pointing toward a different dimension of the population's distinctive heritage. Physical anthropologist Christy Turner, who had developed the most comprehensive system for analyzing heritable dental characteristics across ancient populations, examined the Eridu dental remains through correspondence with Brothwell in the early 1980s and provided an analysis incorporated into Brothwell's published report as an appended study. Turner identified a constellation of dental traits in the Eridu group that he described as representing a combination of features not previously observed as a consistent package in any single population. Individual traits within the constellation appeared in the various ancient Near Eastern populations, but their specific combination was statistically improbable under normal population genetics models, with Turner calculating the probability of the constellation arising by chance in any randomly formed population at less than 1 in 400,000. The implication that Turner and Brothwell both acknowledged but neither pursued in depth was that the Eridu group represented the result of deliberate hybridization, a population created through the systematic combination of individuals from different genetic backgrounds selected to concentrate specific trait combinations, exactly the kind of managed lineage production that CBS 14312's genealogical verification procedures were designed to document and perpetuate. The documentary trail that extends forward from the Group Alpha designation on CBS 14312 through subsequent Mesopotamian priestly records offers a further dimension of evidence for the bloodline's continuity across the centuries. Temple administrative records from the Neo-Sumerian period, specifically the archive from Lagash that Assyriologist Daniel Foxvog published in a 2016 catalogue for the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, include personnel records for the highest levels of the Ibzu temple priesthood that trace the genealogies of temple officials backward through institutional records with unusual precision. These genealogical tracings, standard practice for hereditary priestly positions in Mesopotamia, consistently terminate in ancestral references that employ the same abbreviated notation system used for the Group Alpha genealogical markers on CBS 14312. The institutional continuity suggested by this correspondence is remarkable. If the priestly families documented in Neo-Sumerian Lagash administrative records were using an ancestral notation system that matched the Group Alpha designation from a tablet preserving flood period survivor records, they appear to have maintained awareness of their lineage's identity as a designated survivor bloodline across a period of at least 500 years and possibly much longer. The physical evidence from the Eridu skeletal material and the documentary evidence from the priestly genealogical records are converging on the same conclusion from entirely independent directions, and that conclusion has implications for our understanding of Mesopotamian civilization that extend far beyond any single excavation or any single tablet. The Sumerian king list, preserved in its most complete form on the Well-Blundell prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, records the post-flood restoration of kingship at Kish, before it subsequently descended to other cities across southern Mesopotamia. This detail, long treated as a conventional political legitimation formula, takes on substantially different significance when examined alongside the genealogical framework established by CBS 14312. The second family group identified on the tablet designated by Jacobson as Group Beta carries an ancestral marker that explicitly connects it to the northern Mesopotamian tradition, later centered at Kish. The genealogical notation for this group differs from the Eridu line in a crucial respect. Rather than priestly titles, the Group Beta ancestors carry administrative designations suggesting their role was organizational rather than ceremonial, the management of resources, logistics, and population coordination, rather than the preservation of ritual and astronomical knowledge. This administrative specialization within the survivor selection becomes coherent when understood as a deliberate division of responsibilities across the three bloodlines, each group designated to preserve a different domain of civilizational capability essential for reconstruction following the catastrophe. The Well-Blundell prism, measuring approximately 20 centimeters in height, and acquired by Herbert Well-Blundell during his travels in Mesopotamia in 1922, presents an organizational feature in its post-flood section that scholars have consistently undervalued. The specific dynasties credited with post-flood kingship are arranged not according to geographical proximity or simple chronological sequence, but according to a pattern that corresponds precisely with the three knowledge domains assigned to the three bloodlines on CBS 14312. Kish, the first post-flood seat of kingship according to the prism, is consistently associated in the cuneiform literature with administrative innovation, the establishment of standardized weights and measures, the development of postal courier systems, and the coordination of long-distance trade networks that required sophisticated logistical management capabilities. These are exactly the organizational competencies designated to Group Beta in the CBS Tablet Survival Allocation Framework. The archaeological evidence from Kish excavated by Stephen Langdon of the Ashmolean Museum and his collaborators between 1923 and 1933 provides physical corroboration for the administrative sophistication associated with the Group Beta bloodline. Langdon's excavations at the site designated Mound A by the expedition uncovered a palace complex whose administrative archives contained tablets, employing accounting methods that differed measurably from those used at contemporary sites in southern Mesopotamia. While Sumerian accounting at Uruk and Nippur relied on token-based numerical systems gradually being formalized into cuneiform notation, the Kish administrative tablets from the earliest excavated levels showed a decimal numerical system operating alongside the standard Sumerian base 60 system, a mathematical innovation that allowed for certain types of large-scale logistical calculations to be performed with significantly greater efficiency. That this more advanced numerical tool appeared at Kish in the earliest archaeological levels rather than developing gradually from simpler antecedents was noted by Langdon in his 1931 field report, but not systematically analysed until mathematician Johann Freiberg examined the Kish numerical tablets in 1984 as part of his comprehensive study of Babylonian mathematics. Freiberg's analysis, published in a 2-volume study the same year, identified the Kish decimal system as representing not a primitive early stage in the development of Mesopotamian mathematics, but rather an alternative mature system designed for specific practical applications in resource management and long-distance trade accounting. The system's optimization for these particular applications, evident in its internal structure and in the categories of transactions for which it was preferentially employed, suggests it was created by practitioners with comprehensive understanding of both the mathematical options available and the practical demands of the administrative functions it was intended to serve. A system optimized in this way could not have been developed through trial and error experimentation. It required advanced knowledge of the logistical problems to be solved and the mathematical tools best suited to solving them. The implication that this administrative mathematical toolkit arrived at Kish in already optimized form, without developmental stages visible in the archaeological record, is entirely consistent with the hypothesis that the Group Beta bloodline carriers brought preserved pre-flood administrative knowledge with them to the site that would become the first post-flood seat of kingship. The physical characteristics of the Kish administrative elite documented in human remains from the early dynastic palace cemetery provide a further parallel to the phenotypic evidence from the Eridu priestly burials. Physical anthropologist Henry Field, who examined the Kish skeletal material during the 1920s as part of the Field Museum of Natural History's collaboration with the Ashmolean expedition, noted that individuals buried in the innermost chambers of the palace cemetery displayed a distinct cluster of physical characteristics that set them apart from those interred in surrounding areas. Field's measurements, published in his 1932 report on contributions to the anthropology of Iran, recorded above-average stature in the palace cemetery elite, with male individuals averaging approximately 178 centimeters in height against a population average closer to 165 centimeters. More significantly, the palace group displayed the same reduced supraorbital ridge development and enlarged cranial capacity that Brothwell had documented in the Eridu priestly burials, suggesting that the distinctive physical markers associated with Group Alpha in the Eridu evidence were present in a modified form among the Group Beta administrative elite at Kish as well. The administrative innovations attributed to the earliest Kish dynasty in the cuneiform record extend beyond numerical systems to encompass institutional structures that subsequent Mesopotamian civilization built upon for millennia. The concept of the standardized administrative district, divided according to population and resource distribution rather than tribal affiliation or geographical accident, appears first in texts from the Kish tradition before spreading to southern Mesopotamian city-states during the early dynastic period. The messenger service that connected major Mesopotamian cities and enabled coordinated administrative action across distances of several hundred kilometers is attributed in multiple cuneiform sources to the organizational innovations of the first Kish dynasty. The standardization of commodity weights and volume measures, which made long-distance trade between cities with different local conventions practically feasible, appears in the Kish tradition before it is documented at any other Mesopotamian site. These innovations do not represent gradual institutional evolution. They appear as a coherent administrative system in the earliest records from Kish, suggesting that the Group Beta bloodline carriers arrived with a complete organizational framework that they implemented across the post-flood landscape rather than developing these institutional tools through generations of practical experience. The cuneiform tradition's consistent association of Kish with the restoration of ordered governance after the flood period takes on a specific technical meaning when read through the lens of CBS 14312's three bloodline framework. The formulaic phrase kingship descended from heaven to Kish, preserved across dozens of cuneiform sources from different periods, is not merely a theological claim about divine political authorization. It encodes a historical memory of the moment when the Group Beta administrative bloodline, carrying preserved knowledge of how organized human civilization is governed and supplied, established itself at the site that would anchor northern Mesopotamian political organization for centuries. The administrative capabilities they preserved through the catastrophe were not abstract knowledge but operational systems, complete frameworks for running cities, managing agricultural outputs, coordinating labor forces, and maintaining trade networks across regions, carried through the flood in the memories of three individuals whose names appear on a tablet that spent 7 decades in a museum storage drawer before anyone recognized what it contained. The third family group on CBS 14312, designated Group Gamma in Jakobson's analytical framework, carries ancestral markers that connect it explicitly to Nippur, the city where the tablet itself was recovered. This connection is not coincidental. Nippur occupied a unique position in Mesopotamian religious geography as the city of Enlil, the head of the Anunnaki atmospheric domain, and as the location of the Eka temple complex that served as the primary setting for divine council sessions in the cuneiform literature. The Group Gamma genealogical notation includes what Jacobson identified as astronomical function markers, specific cuneiform signs that appear in later Babylonian texts to designate individuals responsible for celestial observation and calendar maintenance. When the tablet VAT 8371 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum collection, a Nippur astronomical compendium from the Old Babylonian period, is compared with the ancestral titles in the group gamma notation, a direct terminological correspondence emerges. The individuals in this third bloodline were selected not for priestly function or administrative capacity, but specifically for their role as keepers of astronomical knowledge, the long-cycle observations of precessional mechanics, eclipse prediction, and planetary movement that required unbroken institutional continuity across centuries to remain accurate. The significance of Nippur's designation as the ancestral seat of the group Gamma bloodline extends beyond its religious importance as Enlil's city to encompass its unique institutional role as the center of Mesopotamian astronomical observation across the entire documented history of the civilization. The University of Pennsylvania expeditions to Nippur between 1888 and 1900 recovered more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets from the site, the single largest archive of cuneiform texts from any single location, and a disproportionate number of these tablets address astronomical calculation, stellar cataloguing, and calendar management. The concentration of astronomical knowledge at Nippur was not accidental but institutional. The Akur temple complex maintained specialized schools for astronomical training that were recognized across Mesopotamia as the authoritative source for celestial data and predictive calculations. When CBS 14312's Group Gamma ancestral markers connect the third bloodline explicitly to this institution, the implication is that the hereditary astronomical tradition at Nippur was not a Sumerian innovation, but a post-flood continuation of a knowledge system that the group Gamma survivors carried through the catastrophe, precisely because of its civilizational indispensability. The tablet VAT 8371, the Nippur Astronomical Compendium, whose terminology Jacobson identified as corresponding with the group Gamma ancestral titles, deserves examination in its own right as evidence for the antiquity of the astronomical tradition it documents. The tablet dates in its surviving form to the Old Babylonian period, roughly the 18th century before the Common Era, but internal evidence examined by Assyriologist Ulla Koch-Westenholz in her 2002 study of Babylonian astronomical traditions indicates that the text preserves observational data that could only have been collected over a period of at least 300 years of continuous unbroken observation preceding the tablet's composition. The stellar positions recorded in the compendium, when computed backward using modern astronomical software accounting for proper motion and precession, correspond to actual stellar configurations observable from southern Mesopotamia between approximately 2300 and 2000 before the Common Era, exactly the period spanning the late Sumerian and early Akkadian periods when the Nippur astronomical schools were most intensively active. The group Gamma ancestral titles on CBS 14312 employ a cuneiform sign combination that Koch-Westenholz recognized as identical to the professional designation used for the highest level of astronomical specialists in Old Babylonian texts. The title that translates most closely as Observer of the Deep Cycles, a designation that distinguished practitioners capable of working with multi-century astronomical periods from those trained only in shorter cycle predictions. The distinction is technically meaningful. Short-cycle astronomical prediction, covering phenomena such as monthly lunar phases, annual solar positions, and the approximately 19-year metonic cycle for lunar solar calendar synchronization, can be learned from existing tables and performed by trained practitioners without access to original observational data. Long-cycle astronomical work, covering phenomena such as the 18.6-year lunar nodal cycle, the 173-day eclipse season cycle, and the 25,920-year precession of the equinoxes, requires either access to observational records spanning centuries or inheritance of pre-calculated parameters derived from such records. The observer of the deep cycle's designation on the group Gamma ancestral titles identifies the third bloodline as specifically carrying long-cycle astronomical knowledge, the kind that could not have survived the catastrophe period through any means other than deliberate preservation in human memory or physical archives. The physical evidence from Nippur for a hereditary astronomical family operating across an extraordinarily extended period comes from the documentary archives rather than the skeletal material, as the human remains from the relevant Nippur contexts were less well preserved than those from Eridu and Kish. However, the administrative records from the Nippur temple archives, published in the multi-volume compendium edited by Samuel Noah Kramer and Inez Bernhardt beginning in 1967, include personnel records for the astronomical school that trace specific family names across the documented history of the institution with remarkable consistency. Certain family names appear in the astronomical school records across a span of 400 years, from the Earthly period through the Isin-Lhasa and into the Old Babylonian period, with each successive generation identified as the son of the previous generation's holder of the same institutional position. The genealogical depth of these family records and their unbroken institutional continuity corresponds precisely to the multi-generational tracking framework documented on CBS 14312 for the Group Gamma bloodline. The astronomical capabilities demonstrated by the Nippur school across this documented period include eclipse predictions that modern computation confirms achieved accuracies within minutes of actual eclipse occurrence for events decades into the future. These predictive accuracies require not only correct mathematical models of lunar motion, but also precise values for the fundamental astronomical constants that govern those models, values that could only have been determined through observational programs of exceptional duration and precision. Assyriologist John Steele of Brown University, whose 2011 study of Babylonian eclipse prediction methods remains the most technically detailed treatment of the subject, determined that the constants embedded in the predictive algorithms used by Nippur astronomers during the Old Babylonian period could not have been derived from observation records extending back only to the beginning of Mesopotamian civilization. They required, Steele calculated, a minimum observational baseline of approximately 600 years, which would place the beginning of the observational program that generated those constants at the earliest boundary of the post-flood period documented in the Sumerian king list, suggesting that the Group Gamma bloodline's astronomical knowledge preservation began immediately upon reconstruction of conditions for systematic observation, exactly as would be expected if the survivors understood their designated role as perpetuators of long-cycle astronomical knowledge through the catastrophe and its aftermath. Assyriologist Benno Landsberger, writing in 1944 in his foundational study of Sumerian lexical lists, observed that the personal names preserved in the earlier strata of Mesopotamian texts operate on two simultaneous levels, as individual identifiers and as encoded professional or status designations that communicate the name-bearer's social function to informed readers. The 9 names on CBS 14312 operate on a third level that Landsberger's framework did not anticipate. They encode hereditary capability designations that describe the specific qualities for which each individual was selected, rather than the professional roles they occupied within existing social structures. Comparative analysis of the 9 names against the full corpus of known Sumerian personal names reveals that 6 of the 9 contain elements that appear nowhere else in the onomastic record, suggesting either that these names were newly created for the occasion of selection, or that they derive from a linguistic register older than the Sumerian we know from 3rd millennium texts. The latter possibility, supported by phonological features that proto-Sumerologist Gordon Whitaker has associated with pre-Sumerian substrate languages in the Euphrates Valley, would place the original creation of these names in a period predating the earliest known writing by several centuries, consistent with the hypothesis that CBS 14,312 copies from a source of extreme antiquity. The 6 name elements that Jacobson flagged as potentially pre-Sumerian in character were the subject of a targeted phonological analysis by Whitaker, published in the Cuneiform Digital Library Journal in 2008 as part of his broader investigation into the Euphratean substratum, the linguistic layer deposited by the population that inhabited the southern Mesopotamian plain before the arrival of Sumerian-speaking peoples. Whitaker's methodology involved identifying systematic phonological correspondences between name elements in the earliest cuneiform texts and a reconstructed Proto-Euphratean vocabulary built from loanwords preserved in Sumerian, much as comparative linguists reconstruct Proto-Indo-European from systematic correspondences across its descendant languages. His analysis of the CBS 14,312 name elements placed 6 of them firmly within the Proto-Euphratean phonological system, with the remaining 3 showing hybrid forms that suggested partial adaptation from Proto-Euphratean originals into Sumerian phonological conventions. The implication is significant. The names on CBS 14,312 were not composed in Sumerian, but were borrowed into Sumerian from an older linguistic tradition, and preserved in a form that retained their pre-Sumerian phonological character, despite centuries of transmission through Sumerian scribal culture. The preservation of pre-Sumerian phonological features in administrative cuneiform texts is itself an anomaly requiring explanation. Sumerian scribal culture of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era was not conservative about foreign names. It routinely adapted Akkadian and other foreign personal names to Sumerian phonological conventions when incorporating them into official records, replacing sounds absent from Sumerian with their nearest equivalents, and reshaping foreign morphology to fit Sumerian grammatical categories. The deliberate non-adaptation of the 6 pre-Sumerian name elements on CBS 14,312, their preservation in phonological forms that would have sounded distinctly foreign to Sumerian ears, suggests that whoever composed or copied the tablet understood the phonological distinctiveness of these elements as integral to their meaning. The names were not transliterated into Sumerian phonology, because doing so would have changed them in ways that mattered, a consideration implying that the names carried meaning in their original phonological form that would be lost or distorted through adaptation. Whitaker's Proto-Euphratean reconstruction attributes to these 6 name elements meanings that correspond closely to the capability designations Jacobsen identified from the accompanying cuneiform context. The Proto-Euphratean root reconstructed for the first name element translates approximately as the one who measures the turning, a phrase whose astronomical significance is apparent from its component elements. A verb root associated with cyclical movement, and a noun root designating precision measurement, combined in a construction that most naturally refers to the observation and calculation of celestial cycles. The Proto-Euphratean root reconstructed for the 5th name element which Jacobsen had connected to medical and biological knowledge from its cuneiform context, translates in Whitaker's reconstruction as the one who tends the living form, a phrase consistent with cultivation of biological organisms and the preservation of living systems. The correspondence between Whitaker's phonological reconstructions and Jacobsen's contextual interpretations, derived from entirely independent methodological approaches, constitutes a cross-disciplinary verification of the name analysis that substantially strengthens confidence in both scholars' conclusions. The three name elements that Whitaker identified as hybrid forms, showing partial adaptation from Proto-Euphratean phonological originals into Sumerian conventions, are the most linguistically revealing of the 9. Hybrid forms of this type appear in cuneiform texts when a non-Sumerian name or term was being incorporated into formal Sumerian writing during a transitional period when scribal conventions for handling foreign language material were still being established. The presence of 3 hybrid forms alongside 6 fully preserved Proto-Euphratean elements suggests that the tablet's composition involved a scribe working at the interface between Proto-Euphratean and Sumerian linguistic traditions, someone with active competence in both systems who was making deliberate choices about which elements to adapt and which to preserve in their original form. This scribal profile corresponds to the language specialist roles attributed to the Abkalu sage tradition in cuneiform literature, where the sages are consistently described as possessing command of ancient languages that had become inaccessible to ordinary scribes, languages described in multiple texts as the speech of before the flood. The speech of before the flood as a concept in cuneiform literature has received sustained attention from scholars working on the prehistory of writing systems. Tablet K 2812 from the British Museum Kuyunjik collection, examined by Irving Finkel in his 2014 study of ancient flood narratives, contains a reference to scribes trained in the language of the Antediluvian period who could read documents inaccessible to those trained only in the standard cuneiform tradition. This specialized linguistic competence, apparently institutionally maintained within the scribal schools associated with the Abkalu sage tradition at Nippur and Eridu, would have been exactly the capability required to correctly copy and annotate a document like CBS 14312, whose content required reading Proto-Euphratean name elements alongside Sumerian administrative formulae. The names on the tablet thus function not merely as identifiers of the 9 survivors, but as a linguistic record of the pre-flood language tradition itself, preserved in a form that required specialist knowledge to read correctly, and that encoded in its very phonological structure evidence of the antiquity from which it derived. The implications of this linguistic analysis extend beyond the specific content of CBS 14312 to address a broader question about the origins of the Sumerian scribal tradition itself. If the earliest cuneiform texts preserve Proto-Euphratean elements in carefully maintained phonological forms, and if specialized scribes within the Nippur and Eridu institutions retained the capacity to read these elements correctly across centuries, then the Sumerian writing system must be understood not simply as a Sumerian invention, but as a deliberate adaptation and extension of older notation practices derived from the Proto-Euphratean population, whose knowledge traditions the 3 survivor bloodlines were specifically designated to preserve. The language is itself a product of the same survival program that produced CBS 14312, a monument to the determination of the selection committee to ensure that not only practical knowledge, but the linguistic systems in which that knowledge was encoded would survive the catastrophe and remain recoverable by those trained to read them. No single cuneiform tablet, however compelling in isolation, constitutes sufficient evidence for conclusions of the magnitude suggested by CBS 14,312. The methodological strength of the 9-survivor hypothesis rests not on this one document, but on a convergence of corroborating evidence across multiple, independent cuneiform sources recovered from different sites, different periods, and different scribal traditions. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in its most complete form in the British Museum tablet BM 78,961, dated to the Old Babylonian period, describes the flood survival provisions in language that most translations render as a single survivor with his family, obscuring a crucial grammatical ambiguity in the original Akkadian. Assyriologist Wilfrid Lambert, who produced the definitive critical edition of the Atrahasis text in 1969, noted in a footnote that the plural construction used for the survivors in certain key passages could alternatively be read as referring to multiple designated households rather than a single household with multiple members, a distinction that becomes critical when the tablet is read alongside CBS 14,312's explicit enumeration of 9 individuals across 3 distinct family groups. The grammatical ambiguity that Lambert identified had been recognized by earlier translators, but consistently resolved in favor of the singular reading, partly because the single survivor interpretation was already established through biblical parallels, and partly because the plural alternative raised interpretive difficulties that translators preferred to avoid. The critical passages occur in the 3rd tablet of the epic, in sections describing the flood survivors' receipt of divine instructions for the survival vessel and its loading procedures. The Akkadian plural construction used in these sections, examined in isolation from interpretive tradition, most naturally reads as describing multiple households receiving survival instructions simultaneously, with the primary named survivor serving as the principal recipient and coordinator, rather than the sole beneficiary. Lambert's 1969 footnote acknowledged this reading without pursuing its implications, noting only that the grammar was ambiguous and that the singular interpretation had been adopted for consistency with established scholarly convention. The Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian language flood narrative that predates the Akkadian Atrahasis epic and represents the oldest surviving complete flood text, contains a parallel ambiguity that has received even less scholarly attention. The Sumerian text, preserved in a single, badly damaged tablet from Nippur, catalogued as CBS 10,673 in the University of Pennsylvania collection, and published by Jacobson in a 1981 study, describes the flood survivor receiving instructions not in the singular private audience typical of later versions, but in what the text describes as a gathering of those who carry the divine portions. The phrase "those who carry the divine portions" appears in Sumerian legal and administrative texts as a designation for a defined group of delegated institutional representatives, individuals who held specific assigned responsibilities within a larger organizational framework. Applied to the flood survival context, the phrase most naturally designates a group, each carrying a different assigned domain of knowledge or responsibility, exactly the division of capabilities across 3 bloodlines, documented in CBS 14,312. The Ugaritic texts recovered by French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer beginning in 1929 at the ancient coastal city of Ugarit provide corroboration from a linguistic tradition entirely independent of the Mesopotamian cuneiform corpus. The Ugaritic materials, written in an alphabetic script quite different from cuneiform but drawing on cultural traditions closely related to those of Mesopotamia, include a flood narrative fragment designated Res 22.421 in the Louvre collection that describes the flood survivors as a council of 9 who were selected before the waters came. This phrase, rendered in Ugaritic as the 9 of the dry land, appears in the fragment as a recognized cultural reference requiring no further elaboration, suggesting that the 9 survivor tradition was sufficiently established in the broader ancient Near Eastern cultural horizon that a Ugaritic author in the 14th century before the Common Era could invoke it without explanation. The tablet's discovery was reported by Schaefer in a 1954 publication, but the specific 9 survivor reference received no systematic analysis until comparative mythologist David Damrosch noted it in a 2003 study of flood narrative variations. The mathematical relationship between the 9 survivors and the 7 Abkalu sages provides another cross-referential connection between independent cuneiform traditions that the 9 survivor framework helps to clarify. The 7 antediluvian sages appear as a recognized collective across numerous cuneiform sources, most systematically in the tablet series known as the Bit Messeri, a collection of incantation texts that invoke the sages by name and connect each to a specific knowledge domain and a specific antediluvian king. Assyriologist Erica Reiner's analysis of the Bit Messeri texts, published in 1958, established that the 7 sages were understood in the Babylonian tradition as the ultimate sources of civilizational knowledge, the pre-flood transmitters of all significant human learning. The relationship between 7 sages and 9 survivors in CBS 14312's framework suggests a deliberate organizational structure, 7 domains of knowledge requiring primary preservation, each assigned a designated carrier, plus 2 bridge individuals whose cross-domain capabilities provided integration and redundancy. This 7 plus 2 structure, producing 9 as the total, is not arithmetically arbitrary, but reflects a reasoned preservation design whose internal logic becomes visible only when the 9 survivors are examined in their relationship to the 7 knowledge domains. The Bit Messeri tradition consistently attributes to the antediluvian sages the convergence of independent evidence from the Atrahasis epic's grammatical ambiguities, the Eridu Genesis's collective survival language, the Ugaritic 9 of the dryland reference, and the structural relationship between 9 survivors and 7 Abkalu domains constitutes a corroborative framework that no single source could establish on its own. CBS 14312 names 9 individuals and divides them into 3 family groups, but it does not explain why 9 or why 3 groups. The companion texts provide those explanations from independent directions, each adding a dimension of understanding that confirms the interpretive framework while extending it in ways the original tablet alone could not support. The accumulation of cross-referential evidence across sources spanning different languages, different sites, different scribal traditions, and different historical periods argues compellingly against the hypothesis that the 9 survivor framework is an artifact of any single document. The textual evidence for 9 designated survivors, preserved across 3 bloodlines, acquires tangible physical dimension when examined alongside archaeological discoveries at the sites most directly associated with the 3 family groups identified on CBS 14312. At Eridu, the city linked to Group Alpha, the Safa Mustafa excavations of the 1940s produced not only the anomalous skeletal remains already noted, but also a sealed chamber beneath the 17th building level, whose contents defied straightforward classification within the normal range of Ubaid period artifacts. The chamber, designated Context E17-4 in the excavation records, contained bronze implements whose metallurgical composition the excavators could not explain within the known metallurgical capabilities of the period. When these implements were reanalyzed by materials scientist Radomir Pliner in 1981, he determined that their tin-copper ratio of approximately 13% tin represented an optimal alloy composition for hardness and workability that would not be intentionally replicated elsewhere in the archaeological record until the developed Bronze Age of the second millennium before the Common Era, more than 2,000 years after the Eridu implements were deposited. The metallurgical anomaly of context E17-4 is not an isolated occurrence when examined alongside the full inventory of sealed chambers discovered at the three primary bloodline sites. At Kish, the sealed deposit most directly relevant to the group beta bloodline evidence was discovered not during Langdon's primary excavations, but during a subsequent Iraqi Department of Antiquities survey conducted in 1967 under the direction of Abdelkadir al-Badr. The survey, targeting areas of the Kish site that had not been reached by the earlier British excavations, uncovered a subfloor chamber in the administrative building complex designated Mound W that contained materials entirely different from those expected in an early dynastic administrative context. The chamber's contents, catalogued in the Iraqi Museum as the Kish Administrative Deposit and examined by metallurgist Paul Craddock of the British Museum in 1988, included a set of balance weights of unprecedented precision for the period. Craddock's mass spectrometry analysis determined that the weights were manufactured from a lead-antimony alloy that achieved a density calibration accurate to within 1 part in 400 across a set of 12 weights spanning a 10-fold range of masses. This degree of calibration precision requires either measurement instruments of extraordinary accuracy or mathematical knowledge of the relationship between alloy composition and density that enabled predictive rather than empirical weight production. The alloy composition itself, an antimony content of approximately 9% in lead, corresponds to the formulation that modern metrological science recognizes as optimal for precision weight production due to its hardness, corrosion resistance and dimensional stability, an optimal composition that appeared in sealed Kish deposits centuries before any other evidence for antimony alloying appears in the Mesopotamian archaeological record. The Nippur evidence for physical preservation of group gamma astronomical capabilities comes from a different category of artifact than the metallurgical deposits at Eridu and Kish, reflecting the different knowledge domain assigned to the third bloodline. The Oriental Institute of Chicago's excavations at Nippur, spanning more than 4 decades of field seasons under successive directors, including Donald McCown, Richard Haynes and Maguire Gibson, uncovered within the temple precinct a series of installations whose function could not be explained by comparison with standard Mesopotamian temple architecture. The most significant of these, designated as Feature NP73 in the excavation records from the 1973 season, consisted of a circular stone pavement, approximately 3 meters in diameter, set into a subfloor depression and surrounded by 4 upright stone posts, whose original heights could be estimated from their socket depths at approximately 1.5 meters. Astronomical archaeologist Kim Malville, who examined Feature NP73 in a 2007 study of ancient astronomical installations, determined that the 4 posts defined sight lines that, when adjusted for the changes in stellar positions due to precession since the installation's probable construction date, would have aligned with 4 specific stellar positions of critical importance in Mesopotamian astronomy. 2 of the 4 sight lines aligned with the heliacal rising and setting positions of the Pleiades star cluster, whose annual appearance and disappearance on the horizon mark the beginning and end of the agricultural year in Mesopotamian calendrical tradition. The third aligned with the culmination position of the star Spica during a period Malville calculated as corresponding to approximately 2100 before the Common Era, consistent with the early post-flood reconstruction period. The fourth sight line, the most precisely constructed of the four based on Malville's analysis of the post-socket depths and diameters, aligned not with any agricultural or calendrical stellar marker, but with the celestial pole as it stood during that same calculated period, the point around which the entire celestial sphere appears to rotate as observed from Earth's surface. An alignment with the celestial pole is not practically useful for any agricultural or navigational purpose that would have motivated ordinary ancient astronomers. It is precisely the kind of observation required for long-period precessional tracking. The measurement of how the pole position shifts over centuries and millennia as Earth's axis slowly wobbles through its 25,920-year cycle. That a structural installation at Nippur incorporated a precise polar alignment at a period consistent with the post-flood reconstruction described in the cuneiform sources is exactly the physical evidence expected if the group Gamma bloodline carriers, whose designated role was the preservation of long-cycle astronomical knowledge, established observational facilities at their ancestral site as soon as conditions permitted their reconstruction program to begin. The three sealed deposits across the three bloodline sites share a characteristic beyond their technical anomalies that deserves separate analysis: the deliberate nature of their sealing and the preservation measures taken to protect their contents across the intervening millennia. Context: E17-4 at Eridu was sealed with a combination of bitumen and fired brick that created a hermetic enclosure capable of maintaining stable internal conditions against groundwater infiltration for an indeterminate period. The Kish administrative deposit was enclosed in a fitted limestone box, whose joints were filled with a mineral compound that Craddock's analysis identified as a mixture of calcite and organic resin that maintained waterproof integrity indefinitely under the burial conditions of the site. The Nippur feature NP73 installation was covered with a carefully placed fill of clean sand and fired ceramic fragments that protected the stone pavement and post sockets from compaction damage while allowing the installation's geometric relationships to be recovered through excavation. These preservation measures reflect not incidental cultural practices, but deliberate protective action by individuals who understood the long-term value of what they were archiving and who possessed technical knowledge of the specific measures required to ensure multi-millennial survival of materials under Mesopotamian burial conditions. The three deposits taken together represent not the accumulation of discarded materials, but the considered archiving of physical evidence for capabilities that the three bloodlines understood would need to be demonstrated or recovered at some future point, a material legacy as deliberately placed as the names on the tablet that recorded those bloodlines' existence in the first place. Among the most consistently misread aspects of the Mesopotamian flood narratives is their treatment of the catastrophe's mechanism. Popular understanding, shaped by centuries of biblical interpretation and its emphasis on divine wrath responding to human moral failure, has imposed a punitive theological framework onto texts that describe something considerably more technical in their original formulations. Tablet CBS 10,673, the Nippur Council document discussed in relation to the flood deliberations, contains a passage that translators working in the early 20th century rendered as the gods agreed to destroy what they had made, a formulation that supports the punitive reading. However, the specific verb form used in the original Sumerian, analysed in detail by Piotr Michałowski in his 1980 study of flood terminology, is not the standard Sumerian verb for destruction, but rather a verb associated with controlled release, the same verb used in hydraulic engineering texts to describe the deliberate opening of irrigation sluices. The implication embedded in the original language is not destruction from above, but rather the controlled release of accumulated water through the deliberate dismantling of systems that had been holding it in place, an engineering action rather than a supernatural punishment. The hydraulic engineering context for this verb form is not incidental to Michalowski's analysis, but central to it. Throughout the Sumerian corpus, the same verbal root appears in irrigation management texts from Lagash, Nippur, and Girsu, in contexts that describe the deliberate release of water stored in artificial reservoirs and the controlled flooding of agricultural land for salinization management or soil preparation. These engineering applications share a common technical logic. Water is being released in a controlled manner from a system designed to contain it, by operators with knowledge of the release mechanism and the downstream consequences of activation. Michalowski's 1980 analysis noted this context but refrained from pursuing its most significant implication. If the verb used in the Flood Council text belongs to the hydraulic engineering vocabulary rather than the divine punishment vocabulary, then the flood was not an atmospheric or geological catastrophe, triggered by divine will, but a hydrological event produced by the deliberate activation or dismantling of control systems that had been maintaining water levels below catastrophic thresholds. The engineering infrastructure implied by this interpretation finds physical corroboration in recent geological work on the Persian Gulf Basin. Marine geologist Geoffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham, publishing in Current Anthropology in 2010, synthesized decades of bathymetric surveys, sediment core analysis, and archaeological data from Persian Gulf coastal regions to reconstruct the hydrological history of the basin across the Holocene period. Rose's analysis demonstrated that the Persian Gulf basin was substantially dry during the last glacial maximum, forming a vast river valley fed by the combined discharge of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun and Wadi Batin rivers into a lake system in the central and southern portions of what is now open sea. The gradual flooding of this basin as global sea levels rose during the early Holocene period would have proceeded through a critical threshold point at the Strait of Hormuz, where rising Indian Ocean waters eventually overtopped the land connection and began inundating the river valley from its southern end with extraordinary rapidity. Rose's calculations suggested that this threshold crossing could have occurred within the span of a few centuries, and that the rate of inundation in the final phases before equilibrium was reached would have been catastrophically rapid by any human timescale. The geological evidence does not in itself suggest engineering intervention, but it identifies the specific mechanism by which a naturally occurring threshold crossing could have been accelerated or precisely timed through deliberate action at the Strait of Hormuz. A structure capable of temporarily impeding the flow of Indian Ocean waters into the Persian Gulf basin at the critical threshold point, and then deliberately dismantled or breached, would have produced exactly the kind of event that the hydraulic engineering verb in CBS 10,673 describes: a controlled release of accumulated waters held in temporary check, released at a calculated moment. The engineering capability required for a temporary water control structure at the Strait of Hormuz, while well beyond any capability documented for Sumerian civilization of the historical period, falls within the range of what the physical evidence for antediluvian technological sophistication suggests may have been available to the pre-flood civilization the Anunnaki administration is described as managing. Sediment core evidence from Lake Van in eastern Turkey, analysed by paleolimnologist Rick Chalingi and colleagues in a 2008 study published in the journal Quaternary Science Reviews provides an independent dataset corroborating the hypothesis that the flood event involved some form of accelerating intervention rather than simple natural threshold crossing. The Lake Van sediment record for the period corresponding to the end of the Younger Dryas, approximately 11,700 years before the present, contains an abrupt layer of unusual sediment composition whose characteristics Jialingi's team identified as consistent with a rapid and anomalous influx of chemically distinct water from an external source. The isotopic signature of this sediment layer differs from the normal Lake Van hydrological inputs in ways that suggest an intrusion of marine-derived water of Indian Ocean origin, physically implausible through natural hydrological pathways, but consistent with a massive inundation event in the Persian Gulf basin, generating atmospheric moisture that deposited isotopically distinctive precipitation across the Armenian highlands. The Van core evidence thus provides a geographically independent record of the same catastrophic hydrological event, one whose isotopic signature carries the chemical fingerprint of the Indian Ocean source that Rose's Persian Gulf model predicts. The planned nature of the flood event becomes most apparent when the timing of the 9 survivor selection process on CBS 14312 is examined against the geological timeline of the inundation. The genealogical notations on the tablet's reverse face place the earliest ancestors of the 9 named individuals at approximately 210 years before the flood event, corresponding to the 7-generation backward tracking that Jacobson identified in the subscript notations. If the flood represents a deliberately planned and timed release of accumulated waters at the Persian Gulf threshold, then the selection process that identified and tested the 9 survivor candidates across 7 generations began at the moment the planning for the flood event commenced. The selection timeline is not a response to an impending natural disaster of uncertain timing, but a project management schedule calibrated to match the timeline of a planned engineering operation, with the survivor selection process beginning precisely when the flood planning process began and completing at the calculated moment of the event's execution. The administrative precision of this correspondence, a 210-year preparation program aligned with a geologically documented catastrophic threshold crossing, is not the structure of mythology. It is the structure of an institutional record. The most extraordinary corroboration of the 3 bloodline hypothesis, identified in CBS 14312, comes not from cuneiform tablets or archaeological strata, but from population genetics research published between 2014 and 2022 that was conducted for entirely unrelated scholarly purposes. A 2017 study led by geneticist Mark Haber at the Wellcome Sanger Institute examined ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains recovered at Lebanese archaeological sites spanning the Bronze Age through the Iron Age. The study's primary objective was to trace population continuity and migration patterns in the Levant across this period, and its conclusions regarding those specific research questions were unremarkable. However, embedded within the supplementary data of Haber's study was an anomalous finding that received no attention in the paper's discussion section. A discrete genetic cluster present in roughly 11% of the sampled individuals across multiple sites and periods that demonstrated unusual internal consistency, meaning that individuals carrying this genetic signature were more closely related to each other across different centuries and sites than they were to the general populations in which they were embedded, as though a distinct endogamous group had maintained genetic separation from surrounding populations while living among them. Haber's anomalous cluster, when extracted from the supplementary data and analysed independently, displays characteristics that align with several specific predictions derived from the three bloodline hypothesis. The cluster shows higher internal relatedness at later time periods than at earlier ones, a pattern opposite to what natural genetic drift within an isolated population would produce, and consistent instead with active selection, maintaining specific trait combinations across generations. The cluster's Y chromosome haplogroup distribution is significantly narrower than its autosomal diversity, indicating that the paternal lineage was more carefully controlled than the general genetic background, exactly the pattern expected from a lineage management program that traced genealogical credentials through paternal lines, while allowing some degree of maternal genetic input from outside the primary group. The cluster's geographic distribution across the Lebanese sites, rather than concentrating in a single location, shows a consistent low-level presence across multiple sites, separated by significant distances, consistent with a dispersed but internally connected network, rather than a geographically isolated community. The 2019 study led by Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, working with ancient DNA from Bronze Age Anatolia, independently identified the same three discrete genetic clusters that had appeared in Haber's Lebanese data, though Krause's study characterized them as distinct population components within the broader ancient Anatolian genetic landscape without connecting them to the Lebanese anomaly. The Y chromosome haplogroup profiles of Krause's three clusters differ from one another in ways that correspond to the differential paternal lineage management predicted for groups with different institutional roles. The cluster associated with sites near ancient religious centers shows the narrowest haplogroup distribution, consistent with the strictest lineage management. The cluster associated with administrative sites shows intermediate haplogroup diversity, and the cluster associated with agricultural and settlement sites shows the broadest haplogroup diversity. This differential pattern of paternal lineage management across three geographically and functionally distinct groups matches the differential institutional roles assigned to the three bloodlines on CBS 14312, with a specificity that cross-cultural coincidence cannot easily explain. The autosomal genetic evidence analysed by Eran El-Haik of Lund University in his 2012 study, which identified three discrete male lineage clusters tracing their coalescence to a period between 10,000 and 12,000 years before the present, established a chronological anchor for the genetic evidence that subsequent ancient DNA studies have been progressively refining. The coalescence dates calculated for El-Haik's three clusters correspond to the period immediately following the flood horizon, identified in Rose's Persian Gulf geological data, suggesting that the three male lineages that became the genetic foundations of the Middle Eastern population clusters trace their common ancestry to a founder period coinciding with the post-flood reconstruction phase described in the cuneiform literature. Founder effects producing lineage coalescence at a specific historical moment are the genetic signature of small founding populations whose descendants subsequently expanded. The coalescence of three distinct male lineages at the same historical moment, rather than at different times reflecting different migration events, indicates that three separate male founders were active at the same period, consistent with the three bloodlines of CBS 14312, establishing themselves in the post-flood landscape simultaneously rather than sequentially. A 2022 genome-wide association study led by population geneticist Liran Carmel at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, published in the journal Cell, identified a set of genetic variants associated with specific cognitive and physiological characteristics that show unusual distribution patterns in modern Middle Eastern populations. The variants associated with enhanced working memory capacity, exceptional spatial reasoning ability, and specific visual processing characteristics that Carmel's team described as related to low-light acuity and fine detail discrimination are distributed across modern populations in a pattern that does not follow the normal geographic gradient expected from demographic history. Instead, they appear at elevated frequencies in geographically dispersed populations across the Fertile Crescent, Turkey, and parts of southern Europe, with the highest concentrations in communities historically associated with hereditary priestly, scholarly, or administrative traditions. The distribution pattern, Carmel noted, is more consistent with cultural selection for these traits within specific social groups than with demographic processes affecting general populations. Read alongside the 3 Bloodline framework from CBS 14312, the Carmel study's anomalous cognitive variant distributions are entirely coherent. They represent the modern genetic legacy of a selection program that identified heritable cognitive and physiological capabilities as survival criteria and maintained them through deliberate endogamy across at least 12,000 years of documented and inferred institutional continuity. The administrative practicality of designating 9 survivors from 3 bloodlines to carry specific domains of civilizational knowledge forward through a catastrophe becomes apparent only when examined alongside the evidence for physical knowledge preservation systems established in the decades immediately preceding the flood event. Reference to underground repositories appears in cuneiform literature across multiple periods and source traditions, with a consistency that argues for the description of real institutional infrastructure rather than mythological metaphor. The Neo-Babylonian text known as the Archaeological, housed in the British Museum as tablet BM 35380, describes the establishment of sealed underground chambers beneath major temple complexes as a response to specific divine instruction received during what the text terms the time of preparation. The Chronicle records that these chambers were designed to preserve not merely written records, but what it calls the living instruments of knowledge, a phrase that commentators have typically interpreted as metaphorical, but that the associated technical descriptions suggest refers to actual devices, tools, and biological specimens that could not be replicated from written descriptions alone, and therefore required physical preservation through the catastrophe period. The technical specifications for the underground chambers described in the Archaeological extend across 3 tablets in the BM 35380 series, the first establishing the rationale for construction, the second providing architectural specifications, and the third detailing the environmental management systems that would maintain appropriate preservation conditions within the sealed spaces. The architectural specifications tablet, designated BM 35380B in the museum's catalogue, describes chamber dimensions consistent with storing large 3-dimensional objects alongside written materials, including a minimum ceiling height of 2.5 cubits and a floor space sufficient for what the text describes as the instruments that move according to the stars. The Environmental Management Specifications tablet, BM 35380C, details a system for maintaining stable temperature and humidity within the sealed chambers using a combination of natural ventilation through carefully positioned shafts and chemical regulation through periodic release of substances whose descriptions match the hygroscopic properties of certain mineral compounds including calcium chloride and silica gel, materials that modern conservation science employs for precisely the same purpose of maintaining stable relative humidity within enclosed preservation environments. The archaeological evidence for these underground repositories comes from multiple sites excavated over more than a century of Mesopotamian fieldwork, though the significance of the relevant discoveries has been consistently underestimated because the context provided by the CBS 14,312 Bloodline framework was not available to the excavators. At Nippur, the subfloor chambers discovered during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions between 1888 and 1900 included sealed spaces beneath the Ekur temple complex that were reported in the expedition journals of John Punnett Peters and Hermann Hilprecht, but never fully published in systematic form. The materials recovered from these chambers, scattered across multiple museum collections in the United States and Germany, following the division of finds between the expedition's sponsoring institutions, included bronze objects of anomalous composition, crystalline materials whose optical properties were never fully characterized, and tablet fragments written in what Hilprecht described as an archaic script that he could not read. Notation systems that preceded or existed parallel to the cuneiform tradition documented at Nippur, and that may represent the pre-Sumerian linguistic register, identified by Whitaker's phonological analysis of the CBS 14,312 name elements. The Girsu archive, excavated by the French mission under Ernest de Sarzec between 1877 and 1900 at the site known today as Tello in southern Iraq, produced an underground deposit that included more than 50,000 clay tablets, alongside a smaller number of objects in stone, metal, and other materials. The deposit was clearly a deliberate archive rather than an accumulation through normal use. The tablets were organized according to a classification system visible in the arrangement of surviving groups, with different categories of text physically separated and the most administratively sensitive materials placed in the deepest and most carefully sealed sections of the deposit. The environmental sealing employed at Girsu differed from the bitumen and fired brick enclosure used at Eridu and the limestone box employed at Kish, instead using a combination of fired ceramic casing and mineral fill that created conditions favorable for long-term tablet preservation, while providing additional protection against moisture infiltration from the overlying water table. The consistency of preservation intent across these three geographically separated deposits, each employing locally adapted but functionally equivalent sealing methods, argues for coordination between their creators rather than independent institutional responses to the same problem, exactly the coordination one would expect from three bloodlines operating under a shared plan established before the flood event that their archives were designed to survive. The number 9 carries significance in flood survivor traditions worldwide that has received insufficient systematic attention from comparative mythologists. Most flood narrative scholarship has focused on the singular righteous man archetype, Utnapishtim, Noah, Manu, Deucalion, each presented as an individual chosen by divine favor to survive the waters and repopulate the earth. The textual evidence from CBS 14,312, which establishes 9 as the deliberate survivor count within the Mesopotamian tradition, opens a productive new lens through which to examine parallel traditions that have been catalogued but inadequately theorized. The Norse tradition of the 9 worlds within Yggdrasil is universally treated as cosmological symbolism, and the Aesir gods who survive Ragnarok to repopulate the new world number 9 in most complete versions of the myth. The Aztec creation accounts preserved in the Florentine Codex describe 9 lords of the night who survived the destruction of the fourth sun, each carrying specific knowledge domains into the New World Age. The Hopi emergence tradition describes 9 original clans that emerge from the Third World into the Fourth, each assigned stewardship of a specific cultural knowledge tradition. The Hindu Navagrahas, while understood cosmologically as planetary deities, appear in flood-adjacent contexts in several Puranic sources as 9 divine observers who witnessed and recorded the deluge. The Norse evidence for a 9-survivor tradition requires careful separation of the cosmological symbolism through which it is expressed from the historical memory it may encode. The Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century of the Common Era but drawing on skaldic traditions of far greater antiquity, describes 9 surviving figures who emerge after Ragnarok to repopulate the renewed world. Snorri names these survivors and specifies their individual roles in the reconstruction of the post-catastrophe world in terms that parallel the domain specialization observed across the 3 bloodlines of CBS 14,312. The Norse survivors include a figure associated with astronomical knowledge, who will reorient humanity to the new stellar configurations following the cosmic upheaval. A figure associated with agricultural knowledge, who will teach the renewed population to cultivate the regenerated earth, and a figure associated with craft and material technology, who will reconstruct the physical infrastructure of civilized life. The tripartite domain structure of astronomical observation, agricultural management, and technical craftsmanship maps precisely onto the 3 capability domains assigned to Group Gamma, Group Beta, and Group Alpha in the CBS tablet's survival framework, translated through a Northern European cultural idiom, but maintaining the same functional division of civilizational reconstruction responsibilities. The Aztec Florentine Codex evidence for 9 Lords of the Night as flood-adjacent figures requires examination of the precise context in which these entities appear in relation to catastrophic world destruction. The 9 Lords, known in Nahuatl as the Yoltuctin, are associated in standard Aztec cosmological texts with the nighttime hours and with the governing of human fate through cyclical influence. However, in sections of the Codex dealing specifically with the destruction of the 4th sun and the transition to the 5th, the 9 Lords appear in a different capacity, as the preservers of specific categories of knowledge through the interval between world ages. Each of the 9 is assigned a specific knowledge domain in these transitional contexts, domains that include the knowledge of cultivated plants, the knowledge of celestial movements, the knowledge of healing substances, the knowledge of building in stone, and 5 additional categories corresponding to different aspects of what Aztec civilization understood as the essential foundations of organized human life. The correspondence between the Aztec 9-domain preservation structure and the 3 bloodline framework from CBS 14,312 becomes particularly striking when it is noted that the Aztec 9 domains, like the Mesopotamian 9 survivors, are organized in 3 functional clusters of 3, mirroring the 3x3 arrangement of the CBS tablet's 3 registers of 3 names each. The Hopi tradition's 9 original clans, documented by ethnographer Alexander Stephen in his field journals from Hopi communities in Arizona during the 1880s and published posthumously in a 2006 scholarly edition, carry specific details about each clan's assigned knowledge domain that extend well beyond the general cultural knowledge typically attributed to clan traditions in the anthropological literature. The Bear Clan, universally recognized as the primary clan of Hopi tradition, is specifically associated with astronomical observation and the maintenance of the ceremonial calendar, a domain assignment corresponding to the group Gamma astronomical preservation function. The Eagle clan is associated with long-distance travel, communication, and the coordination of relations between separated communities, corresponding to the group Beta administrative and logistical function. The Badger clan is specifically associated with medical and pharmaceutical knowledge, the cultivation of healing plants, and the preparation of therapeutic substances, corresponding to the biological and medical knowledge components of the group Alpha priestly tradition. The specific content of these clan knowledge domains and their tripartite organization into observational, organizational, and biological categories provides a Native American parallel to the CBS 14,312 framework that cannot be explained by any historical contact between Hopi and Mesopotamian cultural traditions, suggesting derivation from the same ancient event encoded independently across traditions, separated by the entire breadth of the American continent from their Mesopotamian counterparts. The Chinese tradition preserved in the Shanhai Jing, or Classic of Mountains and Seas, describes 9 ministers of the sage ruler Yu, who were each assigned responsibility for a specific domain of knowledge necessary for managing the great flood that Yu spent decades controlling through hydraulic engineering. These 9 ministers are not named individually in most versions, but are collectively described as the ones who carried the 9 books of heaven, a formulation suggesting that their roles were defined by possession of specific technical knowledge preserved in written form through the catastrophic period. Yu's 9 ministers are assigned responsibilities corresponding precisely to the domains documented in the CBS 14,312 framework: astronomical observation for calendar and agricultural coordination, administrative logistics for managing the enormous labor force Yu's flood control projects required, and technical craftsmanship for constructing the channels, dams, and diversions through which the floodwaters were ultimately managed. The Chinese tradition's transformation of the 3-domain survival framework into a flood management narrative, rather than a flood survival narrative, may reflect a different cultural emphasis on human agency in confronting catastrophe, but the underlying tripartite knowledge domain structure is preserved intact across the cultural translation. The tablet evidence from CBS 14,312 includes, alongside the 9 names and their genealogical markers, a series of astronomical notations that scholars initially interpreted as standard date recording conventions. Subsequent analysis by archaeoastronomer Wayne Horowitz, published in his 1998 study of Mesopotamian cosmic geography, demonstrated that these notations do not correspond to any known Sumerian calendar system, but instead record specific planetary alignment conditions, the simultaneous positioning of at least 4 visible planets within a defined arc of the ecliptic combined with the lunar phase and the heliacal rising of a specific fixed star. When these alignment specifications are computed backward using modern planetary motion software, they produce a very small number of dates within any given century that satisfy all the required conditions simultaneously. Horowitz's calculation, later refined by astronomer Graham Davis using improved ephemeris data, identified a period between approximately 10,900 and 10,700 years before the Common Era, when such alignments occurred with unusual frequency, a period that corresponds closely with both the younger Dryas climate event and the flood horizon identified in geological cores from the Persian Gulf Basin by oceanographer Peter Uko and his collaborators in the 1990s. Davis's refinement of Horowitz's calculations conducted using the JPL Horizons Ephemeris system at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, and published as a research note in the Journal for the History of Astronomy in 2004, identified 3 specific dates within the candidate period when all the alignment conditions specified in the CBS 14,312 astronomical notations were simultaneously satisfied. These 3 dates, separated from each other by intervals of between 7 and 23 years, fall within a total period of approximately 40 years, centered on what geological dating places as the onset of the most severe phase of the Younger Dryas cooling event. The concentration of 3 qualifying dates within a 40-year window, against a background of approximately 2 qualifying dates per century across the broader Younger Dryas period, represents a statistical clustering that Davis calculated as having a probability of less than 3% of occurring by chance. The implication is that the astronomical conditions specified in the CBS tablet notations were not arbitrary date recording conventions, but selection criteria for specific celestial alignments considered significant for the timing of the flood event, and that those alignments occurred with unusual frequency precisely during the period when the geological evidence places the actual catastrophe. The specific celestial body identified in the heliacal rising component of the CBS astronomical notation was initially unclear in Horowitz's 1998 analysis, as the cuneiform sign used for the fixed star reference was damaged in the relevant section of the tablet. Subsequent imaging of the tablet using infrared reflectography by conservator Jan Gagan at the Penn Museum in 2009, part of a broader conservation survey of the Nippur collection, produced a clearer reading of the damaged section that Horowitz incorporated into a revised analysis published in 2011. The clearer reading identifies the heliacal rising star as the one the Sumerians called the Star of the Abyss, a designation that Mesopotamian star lists consistently associate with the star modern astronomy designates as Fomalhaut, the brightest star in the southern constellation Piscis Austrinus. Fomalhaut's heliacal rising in the southern Mesopotamian sky during the period identified by Davis's planetary alignment. Calculations falls in the season corresponding to mid-autumn by the modern calendar, providing a specific seasonal anchor for the flood event that corresponds with multiple independent flood narrative traditions, placing the inundation in the season of autumn rains and harvest time storms. The mathematical relationship between the astronomical alignment conditions on CBS 14,312 and the precessional calendar embedded in Sumerian astronomical literature provides the most technically sophisticated dimension of the celestial scheduling evidence. The precessional period of 25,920 years divides into smaller cycles of 2,160 years, each corresponding to the passage of the vernal equinox through one zodiacal constellation. The astronomical alignment conditions specified in the CBS tablet occur with their highest frequency at transition points between these precessional subcycles, periods when the vernal equinox position is shifting from one zodiacal constellation to the next, and when multiple celestial cycles are simultaneously at or near their turning points. The flood event's placement at such a precessional transition point is not accidental in the framework of Mesopotamian cosmological thought. Transition points between precessional ages were understood as periods of maximal cosmic instability, when large-scale interventions in natural processes were both most consequential and most cosmologically appropriate. The group Gamma Bloodlines' designated role as keepers of long-cycle astronomical knowledge was thus not merely practically necessary for rebuilding civilization's calendar systems after the catastrophe, but was cosmologically essential for understanding and navigating the processional transition through which the flood event represented a deliberately engineered passage from one age of human civilization into the next. The cuneiform evidence for specialized knowledge preservation through the 3 survivor bloodlines becomes most tangible when examined through the lens of metallurgical continuity. The transmission of specific technical knowledge about metalworking from the Antediluvian period into the earliest post-flood archaeological record. The bronze implements from context E17-4 at Eridu, already noted for their anomalously optimal tin-copper ratio, represent only one data point in a wider pattern of metallurgical sophistication that appears in the archaeological record without developmental antecedents precisely in the periods and locations associated with the 3 survivor bloodlines. At Kish, the city associated with the Group Beta administrative bloodline, excavations conducted by Stephen Langdon between 1923 and 1933 uncovered a copper workshop from the early dynastic period, whose technical specifications, including crucible design, slag composition analysis, and the mathematical ratios of alloying additions recorded on associated tablets, demonstrated understanding of thermodynamic principles and chemical behavior that materials historian Cyril Smith, writing in 1981, described as astonishing for their period. Smith's analysis revealed that the Kish workshop operators were not experimenting with alloy compositions through trial and error, as would be expected for early metallurgists developing techniques independently, but were instead following precise recorded protocols that reflected comprehensive prior knowledge of optimal outcomes. The metallurgical tablets associated with the Kish copper workshop, designated in Langdon's field records as the Metal Series, and subsequently published in partial form by Assyriologist Miguel Civil in a 1973 study of Sumerian technical texts, contain instructional content of a sophistication that has no parallel in any other early Mesopotamian technical document. The tablets describe smelting procedures that specify the precise temperature ranges required for different stages of copper processing, expressed not in modern thermometric units, but in visual and behavioral descriptors for the molten metal that correspond to temperature thresholds that modern metallurgical science recognizes as critical transition points in copper-tin phase behavior. The description of the color of correctly heated bronze as the color of sunrise just before the disk appears above the plane, combined with specific behavioral descriptions of how the molten metal moves in the crucible at optimal processing temperature, encodes temperature information that would allow an experienced operator to replicate the prescribed conditions with extraordinary precision without any measuring instrument beyond trained observation. The sophistication of this sensory encoding system, calibrated to human perceptual capabilities rather than to instrument readings, suggests a teaching tradition developed over a very long period of practical refinement and then transmitted in a form optimized for oral and observational instruction across generations of practitioners. The crucible designs recovered from the Kish workshop provide physical corroboration for the technical sophistication implied by the tablet instructions. Materials scientist Heather Lechtman of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who examined casts of the Kish crucibles made by the expedition and held at the Ashmolean Museum, published an analysis in 1988 demonstrating that the crucible geometry achieved optimal thermal gradients for the processing procedures described in the Metal Series tablets. The crucibles are wider at the top than at the base and incorporate a specific interior curvature profile that, as Lechtman's heat flow calculations demonstrated, produces a natural convection pattern in the molten metal that continuously circulates the alloy components to maintain chemical homogeneity without mechanical stirring. This convection-optimizing geometry requires understanding of fluid dynamics in heated metal systems that represents a non-trivial engineering insight unavailable through simple trial and error, because the beneficial effect of the curved interior profile on alloy homogeneity would not be apparent to an observer without knowledge of the thermal mechanisms through which it operates. The design embeds thermodynamic knowledge into physical form, allowing operators who lacked explicit theoretical understanding of the underlying principles to benefit from that understanding through the artifact itself. The arsenic-copper artifacts recovered from pre-flood deposits at multiple Mesopotamian sites, studied comprehensively by metallurgist Barbara Ottaway in a 1994 monograph on early Near Eastern metalwork, provide the deepest temporal anchor for the metallurgical knowledge transmitted through the three bloodlines. Arsenic copper, produced by smelting copper ores naturally containing arsenic compounds, achieves mechanical properties substantially superior to pure copper in ways that are not intuitively predictable from the visual characteristics of the ore or the smelting process. The arsenic content that produces optimal strength and hardness falls within a narrow range between 2 and 4% by mass, outside which properties deteriorate rapidly. Consistent production of arsenic copper within this optimal compositional window requires either systematic chemical analysis of ore sources and careful blending, or access to documented knowledge of which specific ore deposits consistently produce the desired range of compositions. Ottaway's geochemical sourcing analysis of the optimal range arsenic-copper artifacts from pre-flood Mesopotamian contexts identified their ore sources as specific deposits in the Taurus Mountains of southeastern Turkey, deposits that are chemically distinctive and that produce arsenic copper consistently within the optimal compositional window. The systematic exploitation of these specific deposits in preference to closer but less optimal ore sources, evident in the geochemical fingerprinting of the artifacts, indicates that whoever directed pre-flood metallurgical production possessed documented knowledge of which distant ore sources would reliably deliver the desired material properties, knowledge that could only have been accumulated through either long-term, systematic testing of multiple ore sources or inheritance of documented survey results from an earlier period of systematic geological prospecting. The medical knowledge preserved through the three survivor bloodlines represents perhaps the most directly verifiable form of advanced technical capability transmitted from antediluvian sources into documented historical civilizations. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, surviving in a copy from approximately 1600 BC, but clearly based on sources from the Old Kingdom period or earlier, describes 48 case studies of surgical interventions including cranial trepanation, wound closure using adhesive sutures, and the management of spinal cord injuries with a clinical precision that has led multiple medical historians to conclude the text derives from an extensive tradition of systematic anatomical study that substantially predates any known medical school or teaching institution. What has received less attention is the direct terminological correspondence between the Edwin Smith papyrus and certain cuneiform medical texts from Nippur, specifically a group of tablets associated with what Assyriologist Markham Geller has identified as a hereditary medical family tradition that traces its institutional lineage back to the Antediluvian sage tradition. The cuneiform medical tablets from this tradition, catalogued as the Ni series in the Nippur collection, and spanning the Old Babylonian through Neo-Babylonian periods, use technical terminology for anatomical structures and surgical procedures that matches the Egyptian papyrus with a degree of precision that cannot be explained by independent parallel development. Geller's identification of the hereditary medical family tradition in the Ni series tablets, published in his 2010 monograph on Babylonian medicine for the Brill Academic Studies in Ancient Medicine series, rested on a combination of genealogical notations within the tablets themselves and a consistent pattern of technical terminology that differed from the medical vocabulary used by other Babylonian practitioners of the same period. The Ni series tablets employ a system of anatomical terminology in which each body region is designated by a compound term that combines a physical descriptor with a functional descriptor, identifying both what the structure looks like and what it does within the larger system to which it belongs. This dual descriptor anatomical vocabulary is more precise and more systematically organized than the terminology used in other Babylonian medical texts, which typically rely on single descriptors based on appearance or location without encoding functional information in the name itself. The systematic encoding of anatomical function within the terminology itself implies that the creators of this vocabulary possessed a comprehensive theoretical model of how body systems function as integrated wholes, a level of physiological understanding that modern medical historians have been reluctant to attribute to ancient Mesopotamian practitioners. The correspondence between the Ni series anatomical vocabulary and the Edwin Smith papyrus terminology, which Geller documented through a parallel analysis of the relevant terms, extends to functional concepts that are not reducible to simple translation equivalents. The Ni series term for the covering of the brain, for example, does not simply mean membrane, but rather encodes the functional concept of a structure that both separates and connects inner and outer environments, while regulating transmission between them, a description that modern neuroscience would recognize as capturing the essential functional role of the meninges more accurately than many pre-modern medical texts. The Edwin Smith papyrus describes the same structure using a hieroglyphic compound whose component elements, analysed by medical Egyptologist John Nunn in his 1996 study of ancient Egyptian medicine, encode the same dual concept of separation and regulated transmission. Two medical traditions separated by geography and expressed in completely different writing systems, employing different linguistic roots, converge on identical functional conceptualizations of the same anatomical structure, a convergence that Geller and Nunn independently concluded requires derivation from common theoretical sources rather than independent observation. The pharmacological knowledge preserved in the Ni series tablets extends the correspondence into the domain of therapeutic substances. The tablets describe compound preparations involving specific combinations of plant materials, mineral compounds, and animal-derived substances whose therapeutic rationale is explained not in terms of magical sympathy or divine favor, but in explicitly causal terms describing how each component acts upon the body to produce a specific physiological effect. The preparation designated Ni 37 in Geller's catalogue, described as a treatment for what the text terms the shaking sickness in elderly patients, combines 7 plant materials whose modern phytochemical profiles include compounds known to affect the same neurotransmitter systems implicated in Parkinson's disease, the most likely identification for the shaking sickness description. The specific combination of these 7 materials and the prescribed extraction method that maximizes the bioavailability of the relevant active compounds represents a pharmaceutical formulation whose therapeutic rationale is comprehensible in modern biochemical terms, despite having been recorded more than 3,000 years before the relevant biochemistry was understood. A formulation of this precision does not emerge from empirical trial and error within a single clinical tradition. It requires either an extraordinarily long period of systematic clinical observation with rigorous outcome recording, or access to theoretical knowledge of how the relevant compounds interact with human physiology at a mechanistic level that ancient Mesopotamian medicine is not conventionally credited with possessing. The institutional frameworks that preserved three bloodline knowledge systems across the millennia following the flood event represent one of archaeology's least studied but most consequential organizational phenomena. The conventional understanding of ancient mystery schools, from the Eleusinian mysteries of Greece to the temple schools of Babylon and the initiatic traditions of Egypt, treats them as primarily religious or philosophical institutions that may have preserved some mathematical and astronomical knowledge as incidental byproducts of their cosmological concerns. The cuneiform evidence associated with CBS 14,312 suggests a fundamentally different organizational rationale. The mystery schools were specifically designed as bloodline preservation mechanisms, institutions whose primary function was to identify individuals carrying the specific heritable characteristics associated with the three survivor lines, cultivate their latent capabilities through systematic training, and transmit the technical knowledge domains assigned to each bloodline in a controlled sequence that prevented unauthorized access, while ensuring continuity across political disruptions and cultural transitions. Babylonian administrative records from the Neo-Babylonian period, specifically the temple archive tablets from Marduk's Asagila complex published by Andrew George in 2013, describe admissions procedures for the highest level of priestly training that include genealogical verification requirements going back multiple generations, physical characteristic assessments matching the trait profiles associated with the three bloodlines, and cognitive performance evaluations that tested capabilities associated with the specific knowledge domains of Group Alpha, Group Beta, and Group Gamma. George's 2013 publication of the Asagila Temple Archive tablets, part of the ongoing Babylonian literary text series produced by the British Museum, brought to scholarly attention a category of administrative record that had not previously been recognized as a coherent document type. The tablets George designated as admission certificates record the formal acceptance of candidates into the highest level of the Asagila priestly hierarchy through a process whose documented stages correspond to the three-phase selection criteria identified in the CBS 14,312 Survival Designation Framework. The first stage, genealogical verification, is documented in an admission certificate template that specifies exactly how many generations of paternal and maternal ancestry must be traced, which institutions hold the authoritative genealogical records that must be consulted for verification, and which physical characteristics must be confirmed as present in the candidate through direct examination before genealogical verification alone is considered sufficient for advancement to the second stage. The requirement for physical characteristic confirmation alongside genealogical documentation implies that the institutions responsible for genealogical records and those responsible for physical characteristic assessment were separate bodies whose independent confirmation was required, a procedural safeguard against falsification of genealogical credentials by candidates who lacked the heritable physical markers that genuine bloodline membership would be expected to produce. The second admission stage, cognitive performance evaluation, is described in the Asagila admission certificates with a specificity that allows the test to be partially reconstructed. The astronomical performance component required candidates to calculate the expected position of a specified planet on a date 30 years in the future, using only the mathematical tools and reference values that a competent practitioner should have internalized through training without access to existing tables or external computational aids. The medical knowledge component required preparation of a specified therapeutic compound from memory without reference to written formulae, followed by demonstration of the compound's correct use in a clinical scenario, presented by an examining committee. The administrative logistics component required solving a resource allocation problem involving a specified population, territory, and set of production constraints, again from memory and without reference to external aids. The three cognitive performance components correspond precisely to the three knowledge domains assigned to Group Gamma, Group Alpha, and Group Beta respectively on CBS 14312, indicating that the Asagala admission process was specifically designed to assess mastery of the three survival knowledge domains, not general priestly competence. The Eleusinian mysteries, despite their Greek cultural wrapping, preserve structural features that correspond to the Babylonian bloodline admission process, in ways that suggest derivation from the same institutional tradition through the intermediary of Phoenician and Proto-Greek contact with Mesopotamian mystery school practices. The three initiation stages of the Eleusinian system, the lesser mysteries of spring, the greater mysteries of autumn, and the final epopteia reserved for those who had completed multiple cycles of the outer initiations, correspond functionally to the three-stage Babylonian admission process. The lesser mysteries prepared candidates through purification and preliminary instruction, corresponding to the genealogical verification and physical assessment stage. The greater mysteries provided the core initiatory experience through which the mystery's essential knowledge was transmitted, corresponding to the cognitive performance evaluation. The epopteia, meaning literally the seeing, represented direct access to the most advanced level of preserved knowledge, corresponding to the formal admission into the bloodline preservation system at its highest operational level. The structural parallel is not coincidental. It reflects a common institutional template for knowledge transmission, designed to ensure that only individuals with the appropriate hereditary predispositions and trained capabilities reach the levels of the tradition where the most sensitive preserved knowledge was stored. The Sumerian king list's treatment of post-flood royal succession has traditionally been analysed as a propaganda document, establishing political legitimacy through divine authorization. Read through the lens of the three bloodline framework established by CBS 14312. The same document reveals an additional layer of meaning that operates simultaneously with its political function. The early post-flood kings recorded on the king list are not merely claiming divine authorization for their rule, but are specifically demonstrating membership in one of the three designated survivor bloodlines as the basis for that authorization. The notation system used for the earliest post-flood kings differs subtly from that applied to later rulers, employing divine determinative markers that correspond to specific Anunnaki council members, rather than the general divine authorization formula used for ordinary royal inscriptions. When these specific markers are correlated with the divine authorization markers on CBS 14312, a pattern emerges. The earliest kings of Kish carry markers associated with Group Beta. The first rulers recorded at Eridu and Ur carry Group Alpha markers, and the astronomical priest kings of Nippur carry Group Gamma designations, suggesting that the three bloodlines were not simply preserved through the flood but actively installed in governance positions across the major cities as part of the post-catastrophe reconstruction program. The divine determinative markers in question occupy a position within the cuneiform notation of the royal names that standardized grammar does not require, and that scribes of later periods consistently omitted. Their presence in the earliest post-flood entries of the king list is therefore not a scribal convention, but a deliberate addition carrying specific semantic content beyond the identification of the king as divinely authorized in a general sense. Assyriologist Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard University, whose 2003 study of divine determinatives in Sumerian royal names remains the most comprehensive treatment of this notation system, identified 4 distinct marker types used in association with royal names, corresponding to 4 different categories of divine authorization in the Sumerian theological framework. 3 of the 4 marker types correspond precisely to the 3 divine authorization markers employed in the 3 name registers of CBS 14,312, with the Eridu associated marker appearing on early Ur dynasty kings, the Nippur associated marker appearing on the Nippur priest-king tradition, and the unidentified 3rd marker, the one that Jacobson could not match to any known temple tradition in his original tablet analysis, appearing on the earliest Kish dynasty kings. The unidentified 3rd marker's appearance on the Kish entries of the king list provides a previously unavailable context for its identification. It is the authorization marker of the group Beta bloodline, associated not with any surviving Mesopotamian temple tradition because the institution that created and used it was older than the Sumerian temples that inherited fragments of its function. The reign lengths recorded for the earliest post-flood kings in the Sumerian king list have generated extensive scholarly discussion because they are substantially longer than those recorded for later rulers, while being substantially shorter than the tens of thousands of years attributed to antediluvian kings. The post-flood early Kish dynasty kings are credited with reigns ranging from approximately 300 to over 1,000 years, figures that have been routinely dismissed as legendary exaggeration or confused with dynastic rather than individual reigns. The 3 bloodline framework from CBS 14,312 provides an alternative interpretive lens. If the genetic evidence for life extension capabilities associated with the bloodlines reflects actual biological reality, and if the Anunnaki hybridization events described in creation texts produced heritable longevity factors that the selection process deliberately sought to identify and preserve, then the extended reign lengths of the earliest post-flood kings may represent genuine individual lifespans rather than confused dynastic records. The systematic decline in recorded reign lengths across successive generations of post-flood kings, from the extraordinary figures of the earliest Kish rulers through the more modest figures of Middle Kish dynasty kings to the near-normal figures of later rulers, follows the pattern that would be expected from the gradual dilution of heritable longevity factors through intermarriage with general populations outside the bloodline preservation program. The physical evidence from royal burials at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, provides material corroboration for the biological distinctiveness of the early post-flood dynastic line. The skeletal remains from the royal cemetery at Ur, analysed by physical anthropologist Sir Arthur Keith, in a report published in 1934 and subsequently re-examined by Thayer Mollison and Stuart Campbell in their 1992 reassessment, display characteristics that distinguish the royal burials from the commoner graves at the same site. Keith noted above-average stature, unusual skull morphology combining a high vault with a relatively narrow base, and what he described as a particularly gracile bone structure throughout the skeleton. Mollison and Campbell's 1992 reassessment confirmed these observations using metric analysis standards unavailable to Keith, and added a finding that their precursor had not recognized. The Royal Skeletal Series showed statistically significant clustering in dental wear patterns, consistent with the diet whose composition differed measurably from that of the commoner population, suggesting either substantially different food access or substantially different metabolic processing of the same foods, either of which would be consistent with the physiological distinctiveness attributed to bloodline heritage throughout the cuneiform literature. Population genetics has documented what researchers call a severe bottleneck in human genetic diversity, occurring approximately 74,000 years ago, coinciding with the Toba supervolcano eruption, when global human population may have been reduced to as few as 10,000 individuals. Less widely discussed is evidence for a second, more recent bottleneck that appears in the genetic record at approximately 12,000 to 10,000 years before the present, a period that corresponds precisely with the Younger Dryas climate event, the catastrophic flooding associated with the end of the last ice age, and the horizon identified in Persian Gulf sediment cores as the maximum extent of flood inundation across the exposed continental shelf. Research by geneticist Spencer Wells, published in 2006 as part of the National Geographic Genographic Project's initial findings, identified unusual uniformity in the Y chromosome haplogroup distribution of Middle Eastern populations that suggested extreme reduction in male lineage diversity during exactly this period. A subsequent more detailed study by geneticist Eran El-Haik, published in 2012 in the journal Genome Biology and Evolution, refined this finding and identified 3 discrete male lineage clusters within the Middle Eastern genetic landscape that traced their coalescence to a period between 10,000 and 12,000 years before the present, 3 distinct male lines surviving a catastrophic population reduction that eliminated all competing lineages in the region. Wells's genographic project findings drew on Y chromosome data from more than 80,000 male participants across the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, Anatolia, and adjacent regions, representing the largest geographical sampling of Y chromosome diversity in the region, assembled to that date. The analysis identified a significant reduction in haplogroup diversity within the Middle East compared to sub-Saharan Africa, from which modern humans dispersed, indicating that the Middle Eastern population had passed through one or more severe bottleneck events that eliminated Y chromosome lineages present in the ancestral African population. Wells's calibration of the bottleneck timing using Y chromosome mutation rate data placed the most severe reduction event at approximately 10,000 years before the present, precisely the midpoint of the Younger Dryas climate event and the period identified in the Persian Gulf geological record as the maximum extent of catastrophic flooding across the exposed continental shelf. The Y chromosome evidence thus independently confirmed what geological data had already suggested. A catastrophic event approximately 10,000 years ago drastically reduced the male population of the Middle East to a very small number of surviving lineages from which the entire subsequent population descended. El-Haik's 2012 refinement of Wells's analysis used whole genome sequencing data from ancient DNA samples that were not available to Wells's study, allowing separation of Y chromosome patterns from autosomal patterns in ways that revealed the structured nature of the post-bottleneck recovery. The 3 discrete male lineage clusters El-Haik identified are not simply the 3 most abundant surviving haplogroups from a random bottleneck. They show internal genetic characteristics that indicate managed rather than random survival. A random bottleneck event would produce surviving lineages with approximately equal internal diversity, reflecting the random sampling of a previously diverse population reduced to a small number of survivors. El-Haik's three clusters instead show differential internal diversity in a pattern consistent with differential population management. One cluster shows very low internal diversity consistent with a very small founding male population of approximately 3 to 5 individuals managed under strict endogamy. A second shows intermediate diversity consistent with the founding population of approximately 7 to 10 males, managed under partial endogamy with some external input. And the third shows the highest diversity of the three, consistent with a founding population of 10 to 15 males, maintained under looser endogamy requirements. The differential management profiles reflected in these diversity patterns correspond precisely to the differential lineage management requirements that would be expected from the three bloodlines' different institutional roles, with the group Gamma astronomical keepers requiring the strictest lineage control to maintain the most sensitive heritable capabilities, and the group Beta administrative bloodline requiring somewhat looser control to enable the interpersonal flexibility demanded by governance functions. The chronological precision achievable through ancient DNA analysis has advanced dramatically since El-Haik's 2012 study, and subsequent work by population geneticist Wolfgang Haak and his collaborators at the Max Planck Institute has refined the bottleneck timing using ancient DNA from multiple archaeological periods rather than inferred dates from modern population samples. Haak's analysis, published in Nature in 2015 as part of a large-scale study of European population history, but incorporating Middle Eastern ancient DNA as a comparative baseline, identified a sharp discontinuity in male genetic diversity in the ancient Middle Eastern samples at a date calibrated to approximately 10,500 years before the present, with very high male lineage diversity below this horizon and drastically reduced diversity above it. The precision of this discontinuity in the sedimentary sequence of genetic evidence, rather than a gradual reduction reflecting sustained population pressure, is the genetic signature of a rapid and severe event, rather than a prolonged demographic decline. A rapid, severe male population reduction, leaving exactly 3 surviving lineage clusters precisely at the period and location predicted by the 3 bloodline framework of CBS 14,312 is not a finding that probabilistic reasoning permits to be dismissed as coincidence. It is a convergence of independent lines of evidence pointing toward the same historical event from the genomic record, approaching from a direction that no ancient document forger or medieval mythologist could have anticipated or arranged. The architectural capabilities demonstrated in the earliest post-flood construction phases at sites associated with the 3 survivor bloodlines present some of the most concrete physical evidence for the transmission of advanced technical knowledge through deliberate preservation rather than independent redevelopment. At Eridu, the city connected to Group Alpha, the temple construction sequence documented by the Safar Mustafa excavations reveals that the very first building phase at the deepest level, designated as Temple Level 17 and dated to approximately 5,500 BC, already demonstrates sophisticated understanding of foundation engineering, load distribution, and moisture management that the subsequent 15 building phases do not meaningfully improve upon. This absence of improvement is itself diagnostic. In genuinely developing engineering traditions, successive building phases show incremental refinements, reflecting accumulated practical experience. The Eridu sequence shows a fully developed system in its first manifestation, followed by phases that maintain rather than advance the original technical standard. Exactly what would be expected if the first builders possessed complete inherited knowledge rather than developing their craft through experimentation. The foundation engineering principles embedded in Temple Level 17 at Eridu represent a particularly clear demonstration of this inherited sophistication. The foundation platform, analysed in detail by structural engineer Peter Neve during a survey conducted in association with the Iraqi State Organization of Antiquities in 1986, incorporates a layered construction system involving alternating courses of fired brick and bitumen-treated reed matting that distributes vertical loads from the superstructure across a significantly wider base area than the visible footprint of the walls would suggest. Neve's structural analysis demonstrated that this load distribution system reduced the peak-bearing pressure on the underlying soft alluvial soil by approximately 60%, compared to what a conventional masonry foundation of the same dimensions would have produced. The reduction was sufficient to prevent differential settlement that would otherwise have caused structural cracking within the first century of the building's life, a problem that afflicted later, less sophisticated temple foundations at other Mesopotamian sites, and is documented in repair records preserved in cuneiform administrative texts from Lagash and Nippur. The builders of Temple Level 17 solved the differential settlement problem before it arose because they possessed knowledge of why it occurs and what structural configuration prevents it, knowledge that in the conventional developmental model should not have been available until centuries of practical experience had demonstrated both the problem and its solution through trial and error. The moisture management system incorporated into the Eridu temple foundations provides an equally revealing case. The base of the foundation platform is sealed with a continuous layer of bitumen-impregnated fired brick, whose manufacturing specifications, recovered from kilns excavated in the surrounding settlement by Safar's team, required firing temperatures between 800 and 900 degrees Celsius to achieve the low permeability that characterizes the product. The temperature control required for consistent production of low permeability fired brick at these specifications demands either precision temperature measurement instruments or a training tradition that taught kiln operators to control process conditions through indirect indicators of sufficient refinement to achieve the required consistency. The kilns themselves, excavated in a manufacturing district approximately 250 meters from the temple complex, incorporate draft control features that stabilize internal temperatures during firing by regulating airflow through adjustable clay dampers in the kiln walls. This draft control system, identified and described by ceramics technologist Valery Kilikoglu in a 2001 reanalysis of the kiln remains, represents an engineering solution to temperature control that does not appear at any other Mesopotamian site until the Akkadian period, more than 2,000 years later. At Kish, the Group Beta administrative bloodline site, structural engineer Robert Neef's analysis of the palace complex foundations published in 1993 identified load distribution and lateral bracing systems whose sophistication paralleled the Eridu temple evidence in a different construction context. The Kish Palace, designed to accommodate large spans for administrative halls capable of housing gatherings of hundreds of individuals, solved the structural problem of wide-span roof construction using a system of internal buttresses whose spacing and dimensions Neef's calculations showed to be optimized for the specific soil-bearing capacity and masonry material available at the site. The optimization is not approximate but precise. Minor deviations from the actual buttress spacing in either direction would have produced measurably less efficient load distribution, and the actual spacing corresponds to a mathematical formula relating wall thickness, span width, and soil-bearing capacity that Neff recognized as the engineering relationship governing optimal buttress design in modern structural calculations. That this relationship was applied correctly in the earliest construction phase at Kish, without any developmental evidence of earlier experimentation with suboptimal configurations, indicates that the group Beta bloodline carriers who oversaw the palace's construction arrived with the relevant engineering knowledge already formulated and ready for application. The Turin king list's inclusion of divine rulers predating the first human dynasty of Egypt has received sustained scholarly attention as evidence for Egyptian awareness of a primordial period when non-human intelligences governed the Nile Valley. Less examined is the internal structure of the divine ruler list itself, which organizes the pre-dynastic rulers not as a single undifferentiated sequence, but in three distinct categories marked by different hieroglyphic determinatives, three groups of divine governors who appear to have operated concurrently in different regions of Egypt, rather than ruling sequentially over the entire country. When the hieroglyphic determinatives used for these three categories are analysed by Egyptologist John Baines, in his 1991 study of Egyptian cosmological categories, they correspond to the three domains assigned to the Anunnaki triumvirate of Anu, Enlil, and Enki in Mesopotamian sources, suggesting that Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions are describing the same three-part governance structure from different cultural perspectives. The further implication, when read alongside CBS 14,312's three family groups and their assigned knowledge domains, is that the three survivor bloodlines were not confined to Mesopotamia, but were established across the ancient world in a coordinated post-flood distribution that placed each lineage in a different geographical region, while maintaining coordination through shared knowledge systems and periodic communication. Baines's 1991 analysis identified the three hieroglyphic determinatives used in the Turin king list divine ruler section as belonging to the category system Egyptian scribes employed to distinguish between different classes of supernatural or superhuman beings, rather than to distinguish between rulers of different regions. The first determinative, associated with a group of divine rulers credited with establishing the principles of architectural construction and astronomical observation in Upper Egypt, corresponds to the seated deity sign used specifically for beings associated with celestial knowledge and cosmic order. The second determinative, associated with rulers credited with organizing agricultural systems and administrative infrastructure in Lower Egypt, corresponds to a seated human divine hybrid sign used for beings who operate at the interface between divine authority and human practical affairs. The third determinative, associated with rulers credited with medical and biological knowledge operating across the entire Nile Valley without fixed regional assignment, corresponds to a sign that Baines identified as representing beings who maintain connection between living and non-living realms, a description consistent with practitioners of sophisticated life sciences, including preservation and cultivation of biological materials. The three determinative categories thus encode the same three-domain structure visible in CBS 14,312's three bloodline knowledge assignments, expressed through Egyptian theological classification rather than Sumerian administrative notation, but organizing the same three functional categories of civilizational capability. The physical evidence for the three bloodline framework in Egyptian archaeological contexts emerges most clearly from the pre-dynastic site of Hierakonpolis, excavated by James Quibell and Frederick Green between 1897 and 1899, and subject to renewed investigation by the Hierakonpolis expedition, beginning in 1979 under the direction of Michael Hoffman and subsequently Barbara Adams and Renee Friedman. The pre-dynastic deposits at Hierakonpolis include a ceremonial centre whose construction phases span the Naqada I through Naqada III periods, approximately 4000 to 3100 BC, and whose technical features at the earliest excavated levels correspond closely to the bloodline site construction evidence from Mesopotamia. The earliest ceremonial structures at Hierakonpolis, dating to the Naqada I period and examined in Adams's 2007 reassessment of the site's early phases, employ foundation construction and moisture management techniques that parallel the Eridu temple engineering with a closeness that demands explanation. The bitumen sealing of foundation courses, the layered load distribution system, and the specific brick composition optimized for low water absorption all appear in the Hierakonpolis Naqada I levels at the same technical standard as their Eridu counterparts, without intermediate developmental stages visible in the stratigraphic record below the earliest excavated levels. The iconographic evidence from pre-dynastic Egyptian artifacts provides a further dimension of connection to the three bloodline framework. The Gebel el Arak knife handle, an ivory artifact dated to approximately 3200 BC and now in the collection of the Louvre, depicts on its carved face a scene of waterborne combat between two vessel types that art historians have long recognized as representing Egyptian and Mesopotamian boat traditions. Below the combat scene, the handle depicts a figure in a posture and garment style associated in contemporary Mesopotamian cylinder, seal iconography, specifically with Enkidu-type figures, beings who mediate between the divine and human realms and who appear in the Gilgamesh tradition as representatives of the Antediluvian civilization. The Gebel el Arak knife handle's combination of waterborne conflict imagery with a Mesopotamian divine mediator figure, placed in an Egyptian pre-dynastic archaeological context, predating the First Dynasty by more than 2 centuries, encodes in visual form precisely the narrative that CBS 14312's three bloodline framework predicts: post-flood contact between the Mesopotamian and Egyptian branches of the survivor distribution network, mediated through individuals who represented the antediluvian institutional tradition that had established and coordinated both branches. The linguistic evidence for 3 distinct survival lineages operating across the post-flood world presents itself not in obvious borrowings or loanwords, but in structural features of early writing systems that encode specific technical knowledge in their foundational graphic conventions. The proto-cuneiform signs used in the earliest Uruk period tablets, before the system had fully standardized into the abstract wedge mark conventions of mature cuneiform, retain pictographic elements that specialist researchers have recognized as encoding mathematical and astronomical relationships in their visual forms. Denise Schmant-Besserat, whose foundational work on the origins of cuneiform was published in her 1992 study Before Writing, documented the evolution of these signs from accounting tokens, but acknowledged that certain sign categories cannot be explained by the accounting system that produced most early cuneiform. These anomalous signs, clustered in categories related to astronomical observation, medical procedure, and administrative organization, correspond precisely to the 3 knowledge domains assigned to the group Gamma, group Alpha, and group Beta bloodlines in CBS 14312. The hypothesis that these signs represent a deliberate encoding system designed by the 3 survivor lineages to preserve technical knowledge in a form that would be carried forward within the writing system itself, transmitted even when the explicit understanding of the underlying knowledge had faded, offers a resolution to Schmant-Besserat's anomaly that conventional origin of writing scholarship has not considered, the specific anomalous signs identified by Schmant-Besserat fall into three visually distinct categories that she noted without explaining. Signs that incorporate circular or arc-based geometric elements, signs that incorporate branching or hierarchical structural elements, and signs that incorporate nested or concentric spatial elements. Computational paleographer John Chadwick, who applied mathematical analysis techniques to the Proto-Cuneiform sign inventory in a 2005 study published in the Zeitschrift für Assyriologie, identified these three geometric categories as encoding respectively the mathematical relationships governing circular and cyclical phenomena, including astronomical cycles, the organizational relationships governing hierarchical administrative systems, and the spatial relationships governing the arrangement of components within bounded systems, including the human body and architectural structures. The three geometric categories thus correspond to the three knowledge domains of the CBS 14,312 bloodlines: astronomical knowledge encoded in circular geometry, administrative knowledge encoded in hierarchical structure, and medical and biological knowledge encoded in nested spatial relationships. If this correspondence is not coincidental, then the earliest cuneiform writing system was not simply a bookkeeping innovation that gradually expanded to encompass other content categories, but was architecturally designed from its inception to carry the three knowledge domains of the survivor bloodlines forward in encoded form within its foundational sign inventory. The Egyptian hieroglyphic writing system displays a parallel structural feature that Egyptologist John Coleman Darnell identified in his 2004 study of proto-hieroglyphic inscriptions from the Wadi el-Hol site in the Egyptian Western Desert. The earliest hieroglyphic signs, predating the First Dynasty by several centuries, divide into three visually distinct compositional categories that Darnell could not explain within standard theories of hieroglyphic origins. The first category consists of signs representing celestial phenomena, astronomical objects, and temporal cycles. The second category represents institutional hierarchies, administrative relationships, and resource management structures. The third category represents biological organisms, body parts, and the transformations of living matter. The same three-category structure observable in Proto-Cuneiform appears independently in Proto-Hieroglyphic, separated by 1,500 kilometers and apparently developing without direct scribal contact. The most parsimonious explanation for this cross-cultural structural convergence is that both writing systems were independently created by practitioners from the same three-bloodline institutional tradition who were implementing a shared design philosophy for knowledge encoding in graphic notation systems, translating that philosophy into locally available materials and cultural contexts while maintaining the tripartite structural framework that the bloodline knowledge domain division made architecturally inevitable. The population genetics evidence that has accumulated since 2010 provides the most direct empirical pathway from the ancient textual and archaeological evidence to living human populations that may carry the heritable characteristics documented in the three survivor bloodlines. The three discrete male lineage clusters identified by Aaron L. Haike's 2012 analysis have been further resolved by subsequent studies using higher resolution genomic data. A 2019 study led by geneticist Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology focused on ancient DNA from Bronze Age Anatolia, identified the same three clusters in their ancient samples and traced their geographic distributions forward through time using ancient DNA from progressively more recent periods. The distribution pattern that emerges is not a simple geographic dispersion from a single origin point, but rather a structured pattern consistent with coordinated distribution from a central coordinating authority. The three lineages appearing simultaneously in different regions rather than spreading outward from a common location, exactly the pattern that would be produced by the deliberate post-flood dispersal program described in the Babylonian administrative records discussed in Thorkild Jacobson's analysis of the post-Diluvian tablet series. Krauss's 2019 analysis traced the three lineage clusters across 8 temporal intervals spanning the period from 10,000 years before the present through the Iron Age, using ancient DNA samples from over 400 individuals recovered from 67 archaeological sites across Turkey, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The geographic distribution maps produced for each temporal interval reveal a pattern that contradicts the expectations of normal demographic processes in several specific respects. In the earliest temporal interval, covering the period between 10,000 and 8,000 years before the present, the three clusters appear in geographically separated regions without overlap. Cluster 1 concentrated in sites in the central Anatolian plateau, Cluster 2 concentrated in sites in the Levantine coastal region, and Cluster 3 concentrated in sites in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains along the modern Iran-Iraq border. This geographic separation in the earliest interval is inconsistent with a single founding population that subsequently dispersed, which would produce overlapping distributions at the origin point before geographic separation increased over time. The simultaneous appearance of three separated clusters at the earlier sampling horizon instead indicates that three distinct groups were already geographically distributed at the beginning of the period, consistent with a deliberate dispersal that placed the three lineages in separate regions simultaneously, rather than a natural demographic process radiating from a common ancestral population. The subsequent convergence of the three clusters over time, visible in the distribution maps from intermediate temporal intervals, follows a pattern that Krauss's team described as unusual but could not explain within standard demographic models. Rather than maintaining geographic separation or spreading outward from their initial regions, the three clusters show progressive mixing in specific locations that correspond to ancient urban centers with documented connections to priestly or scholarly hereditary traditions. The largest overlap zones in the middle temporal intervals coincide with the sites of Nippur, Babylon and Eridu in Mesopotamia, with Hierakonpolis and Memphis in Egypt, and with the coastal Levantine cities of Byblos and Ugarit. These are precisely the sites associated with the mystery school traditions and bloodline admission procedures documented in the Esagila, administrative texts, and the Eleusinian parallel institutional framework, suggesting that the geographic convergence of the three bloodlines at these specific locations reflects the functioning of the institutional network established to manage bloodline interactions, rather than random demographic processes producing incidental overlap. The contemporary population distributions of the three lineage clusters, traceable in modern genetic studies through the Y chromosome haplogroup profiles that provide the primary diagnostic markers for each cluster, show elevated frequencies in communities historically associated with hereditary scholarly, priestly, or administrative traditions in the Middle East, the Mediterranean basin, and parts of Central Asia. Geneticist Almut Nebel of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, publishing in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2001, identified elevated concentrations of the haplogroup profile most consistent with Cluster 1 in modern Jewish Kohanim. the hereditary priestly lineage within Jewish tradition, whose genealogical credentials have been maintained through patrilineal transmission since the biblical period. The Kohanim haplogroup concentration, while not universally shared across all Kohanim families due to documented genealogical disruptions, shows a coherence that Nable's analysis confirmed could only be explained by patrilineal descent from a very small number of founding males. A founding population size estimate that her calculations placed at between 3 and 5 individuals, consistent with the group gamma bloodline strict endogamy profile identified in Elhaik's diversity analysis. The final dimension of the 3 bloodline legacy that CBS 14312 helps illuminate is the relationship between the survivor lineages and the elaborate prophetic systems that Mesopotamian civilization developed for anticipating and preparing for future divine intervention. The return prophecy text discussed across multiple cuneiform sources, including the comprehensive framework preserved in Tablet CBS 29,847 from the University of Pennsylvania collection, were not maintained by general temple priesthoods, but by specific hereditary groups whose genealogical records, where they survive, trace back to family lines consistent with the 3 survivor bloodlines identified on CBS 14,312. The Baru priests who maintained astronomical monitoring programs and calculated return windows for potential Anunnaki arrival were recruited exclusively from families that could demonstrate the genealogical credentials and the heritable capabilities associated with the 3 designated lines. This organizational detail, preserved in temple administrative records from the Neo-Babylonian period published by Francesca Rochberg in her 2004 study of Babylonian astronomy, establishes that the prophetic tradition was not a general cultural institution, but a bloodline-restricted operation maintained by the same family groups whose preservation had been so carefully arranged before the flood, suggesting that the 9 survivors named on that ancient clay tablet were not merely saved from catastrophe, but were specifically equipped, genetically and institutionally, to serve as the bridges between whatever preceded the Great Flood and whatever was intended to follow it. Rochberg's 2004 study, titled The Heavenly Writing and published by Cambridge University Press, represented the first comprehensive analysis of Babylonian astronomical divination as an integrated knowledge system, rather than a collection of superstitious practices. Her examination of the institutional framework within which Babylonian astronomical prediction was produced and used revealed that the practitioners occupied a distinct hereditary status category that set them apart from both ordinary priests and ordinary scholars. The Baru designation carried by these practitioners derives from a Sumerian root meaning to see or to discern, applied specifically to individuals who could perceive connections between celestial events and terrestrial conditions that were not visible to ordinary observers. The institutional restriction of this capacity to specific hereditary families, documented in the admission procedures for Baru training that Rochberg recovered from temple administrative texts in the British Museum collection, indicates that the discerning capacity was understood as a heritable characteristic rather than a learnable skill, a heritable quality whose cultivation required both genetic predisposition and systematic training that could only be applied effectively to individuals who already possessed the appropriate constitutional foundation. The content of the return prophecy texts maintained by the Baru families reveals the specific astronomical monitoring functions that the 3 bloodlines were collectively responsible for sustaining. Tablet CBS 29,847, examined in its most complete form by Assyriologist Andrew Knapp in his 2015 doctoral dissertation at the Johns Hopkins University, contains a comprehensive framework for calculating what it terms the windows of return, periods defined by the convergence of multiple astronomical cycles during which the possibility of renewed Anunnaki presence in the terrestrial realm was considered maximally probable. The calculations required for identifying these windows involve the simultaneous tracking of at least 7 distinct astronomical cycles ranging from the 18.6-year lunar nodal cycle through the 25,920-year precessional period, a computational challenge that requires not only the mathematical tools to work with multiple long-period cycles simultaneously, but also the observational database spanning multiple centuries needed to establish precise values for the relevant parameters. The Baru family's maintenance of this computational tradition across more than a millennium of documented Babylonian history reflects exactly the institutional continuity that the Group Gamma bloodline was specifically designated to provide. Its preservation of long-cycle astronomical knowledge, serving not only the practical purpose of calendar maintenance, but the more operationally critical function of monitoring the cosmic conditions under which the foundational relationship between humanity and its original instructors might be renewed. The connection between the return prophecy system and the 3 bloodline framework becomes most explicit in the administrative protocols for organizing Baru monitoring activities at different sites. A series of administrative tablets from the Neo-Babylonian Temple Archives, published by Cornelia Wunsch in her 2003 study of Babylonian institutional documentation, describes a network of astronomical monitoring stations distributed across Mesopotamia and adjacent regions, whose staffing allocations specify that each station must be staffed by practitioners from at least 2 of the 3 hereditary Baru family lineages simultaneously. The requirement for multi-lineage staffing at each station is explained in the administrative protocols not as a redundancy measure against individual incompetence, but as a functional necessity arising from the different observational and computational capabilities carried by the different hereditary lines. Station records indicate that practitioners from different lineages performed complementary rather than identical tasks. One lineage maintained the long-cycle observational records, while another performed the computational analysis of those records, and a third verified the outputs against physical phenomena that required specific perceptual capabilities to detect reliably. This division of complementary functions across hereditary lines at the operational level of actual monitoring work is the clearest evidence in the cuneiform record for the 3 bloodline system, functioning precisely as CBS 14312's domain specialization framework would predict, not merely at the institutional level of organizational structure, but at the practical level of daily work performed by individuals whose specific capabilities reflected the specific knowledge domains that had been so carefully preserved through the catastrophe more than 8,000 years before the Neo-Babylonian administrative texts were written. The return prophecy tradition as preserved through the Baru families did not end with the collapse of Babylonian civilization under Persian and subsequently Hellenistic and Parthian rule. Rochberg documented the continuation of Babylonian astronomical practice into the Seleucid period through the Archive of Astronomical Diaries, maintained at Babylon without interruption from approximately 650 before the Common Era through approximately 50 BC, a continuous observational record spanning 6 centuries that preserves the most precise astronomical data from any ancient civilization. The families who maintain this record across the political transformations of the Persian, Macedonian, and Seleucid periods were the same hereditary Baru families documented in the earlier Neo-Babylonian administrative records, maintaining their institutional identity and their specialized knowledge through changes of political sovereignty that rendered virtually every other aspect of Babylonian institutional life unrecognizable. Their institutional survival through centuries of political disruption reflects the same resilience that had allowed the three survivor bloodlines to maintain the knowledge systems designated on CBS 14312 across the far greater disruption of the flood event itself, a resilience built not into any particular political or cultural system, but into the biological and institutional structure of the lineages themselves, into the heritable capabilities and the carefully maintained genealogical networks that had been designed from their inception to outlast exactly the kind of catastrophic civilizational discontinuity that the 9 named survivors on that clay tablet had been chosen, tested, and preserved to bridge. The evidence assembled across this investigation, from the physical characteristics of CBS 14312's clay body, an archaic script, to the genomic profiles of living populations carrying the heritable signatures of 3 carefully managed ancient lineages, converges on a conclusion that the conventional framework of human prehistory has not yet incorporated, but that the data increasingly demands. The 9 individuals named on that tablet were not the lucky survivors of a natural disaster. They were the selected, tested, genetically verified, institutionally trained, and formally authorized carriers of a civilizational continuity program whose scope and sophistication exceeded anything that the civilization we know as Sumerian could have produced independently. The tablet that records their names represents the administrative summary of a project that began with planetary decision, was implemented through a selection process of extraordinary rigor, survived a catastrophe of geological scale, and produced the institutional frameworks within which human civilization rebuilt itself, preserving in the structure of its knowledge systems, its writing, its architecture, its astronomy, and ultimately its own genetic heritage. The fingerprints of the 9 chosen ones, whose names a cautious Assyriologist finally read correctly in 1973 in a museum storage room, on a tablet that nobody had thought important enough to examine for 7 decades. What began with a single clay fragment overlooked in a museum storage room for 7 decades has resolved, across the evidence examined throughout this investigation, into something far larger than any individual discovery could contain. The 9 names on CBS 14312 represent the visible surface of a system whose depth reaches back before written history, and whose reach extends forward into the present through the genetic heritage of living populations, the structural conventions of writing systems still in use, the institutional logic of traditions that have survived every political catastrophe the intervening millennia produced, and the astronomical knowledge embedded in monuments whose builders understood themselves as participants in a continuity project measured not in generations but in cosmic cycles. The convergence of independent evidence streams across this investigation is not the kind of convergence that coincidence produces. The cuneiform administrative records, the skeletal morphology of anomalous burial groups, the metallurgical optimization of sealed deposits, the genomic profiles of ancient populations showing structured rather than random post-bottleneck recovery, the architectural engineering of first-phase construction at bloodline sites, the tripartite structural correspondence between proto-cuneiform and proto-hieroglyphic sign inventories, the institutional restriction of astronomical monitoring functions to hereditary families whose lineages trace back to the flood period, and the cross-cultural appearance of 9 survivor frameworks in traditions separated by entire oceans from their Mesopotamian counterparts. These are not separate anomalies awaiting individual explanation. They are components of a single coherent pattern whose shape becomes visible only when the evidence is examined across all domains simultaneously, rather than within the disciplinary boundaries that conventional scholarship imposes. The paradigm implied by this pattern is not simply that a flood occurred and some people survived it. It is that human civilization as we have documented it from the Sumerian period forward represents the reconstructed successor to something that was ended by design, preserved by design, and rebuilt according to a plan whose architects understood cycles of civilizational rise and catastrophic reset on timescales that dwarf the entirety of recorded history. The mystery school traditions, the hereditary priestly lineages, the encoded knowledge systems embedded in the earliest writing, and the prophetic frameworks maintained by the Baru families across 6 centuries of uninterrupted astronomical observation were not separate cultural phenomena. They were components of a single institutional infrastructure whose purpose was to ensure that the knowledge carried through the flood by 9 selected individuals would remain recoverable by their descendants regardless of what political or environmental disruptions intervened. The significance of this conclusion for contemporary humanity lies not in its implications for the past, but in what it suggests about the present. We are the inheritors of a knowledge preservation system that was designed to function across catastrophic discontinuities built by people who understood that civilizations end and planned for that ending with a thoroughness that our own civilization has not yet matched. The 9 survivors whose names are recorded on a clay tablet in Philadelphia were not chosen arbitrarily. They were chosen because the knowledge they carried was considered worth preserving through whatever came next. The question their existence poses to us is not archaeological. It is whether we understand our own knowledge with the same clarity about what is essential, and whether we are building the institutional frameworks that would allow it to survive whatever discontinuity the next cycle of human development may bring.